The gun wasn't pointed at Coulter Vane. It was pointed at the woman standing between him and certain death. Blood soaked through his shirt, his vision blurred, but all he could see was Willa Hartley's unwavering stance, her children huddled behind her, and the man who claimed to own her past. This is the story of how a widow with nothing and a rancher with everything to lose built something the New Mexico dust couldn't bury. Stay until the end and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The heat came first. It always did in New Mexico territory, arriving before dawn like an unwelcome guest who knew the door would never be locked against it. By the time the sun crested the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the summer of 1889, the heat had already settled into the bones of the land, baking the red earth until it cracked into 1,000 small wounds. Coulter Vane stood on the porch of his ranch house, a structure that had weathered 23 winters and seemed determined to weather 23 more through sheer stubbornness. The wood had gone gray with age and sun, the paint, what little remained, peeling away like dried skin. But the house stood square and solid, its shadow falling across a yard packed hard as stone by years of boots and hooves. He was 42 years old, though the desert had a way of adding years to a man that had nothing to do with time. His face was lean and weathered, lines carved deep around eyes the color of creek water after rain, gray-green and distant. His hair, dark brown shot through with premature silver, needed cutting. His hands, calloused and scarred from decades of rope and leather and the 1,000 small violences of ranch work, held a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't noticed. Coulter Vane had gotten good at not noticing things. It was easier that way. Easier not to notice the silence that filled the house like something with weight and substance. Easier not to notice the empty chair at the kitchen table, the garden gone to weeds, the way dust settled on surfaces and stayed there because there was no one to care, no one to sweep it away, no reason to try. Sarah had been dead for 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days if he was counting. He tried not to count, but the numbers accumulated anyway, piling up like the unpaid bills in the desk drawer, like the unread letters from his sister in Kansas City, like the meals he'd stopped bothering to cook because what was the point of cooking for one man who didn't taste anything anyway? The ranch ran itself, more or less. 40 head of cattle, a dozen horses, 200 acres of scrubland and canyon country that produced more rock than grass. He had 3 ranch hands, Miguel, who'd worked for Coulter's father, Tom, who was young and eager and asked too many questions, and Davies, who was old and silent and asked nothing at all. They kept the cattle alive, mended the fences, broke the horses that needed breaking. They didn't need Coulter for much except to sign their pay vouchers at the end of each month, which was fine. Coulter didn't need to be needed. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, learned it the night Sarah's fever broke wrong, and she'd slipped away while he held her hand and begged God for mercy that never came. Needing things, wanting things, it just gave the universe something to take from you. So he'd stopped needing, stopped wanting, stopped everything except the bare mechanics of survival. Wake up, drink coffee, check the stock, ride the property line, come home when the sun set, sleep if sleep came, and start again when the sun rose. Day after day after day, each one exactly like the last, until they blurred together into a single endless afternoon of dust and heat and silence. But the silence was getting harder to ignore. It pressed against him at night, thick and suffocating in the empty house. It followed him during the day, riding alongside him on the range, settling over his shoulders like a weight. He'd tried to outrun it, riding farther, working harder, staying away from the house until exhaustion made him stagger. But the silence was patient. It was always waiting when he came home. So when Miguel suggested, carefully, that maybe the boss should hire someone to cook and keep the house, Coulter had surprised himself by not refusing immediately. "You burning my meals, Miguel?" he'd asked, his voice rusty from disuse. Miguel had shifted his weight, his hat in his hands, choosing his words with care. Miguel was 63 and had known Coulter since Coulter was 10 years old, which meant he was one of the few people on earth who could speak plainly without getting thrown off the property. "No, boss, but I'm thinking maybe you're tired of mine, and maybe—" He'd paused, then pushed forward. "Maybe the house needs someone in it besides ghosts." Coulter had wanted to be angry at that, wanted to feel something hot and sharp, that would justify walking away from the conversation. But he just felt tired. So tired his bones ached with it. "I'll think about it," he'd said, which was more than he'd offered anyone in 3 years. 2 days later, he rode into Socorro, the territorial town 15 miles south, and posted a notice on the board outside the general store. "Hiring, ranch cook, meals for one, room provided. Inquire at Vane Ranch, Black Mesa Road." He hadn't expected much response. The work was isolated, the pay modest, and most folks in Socorro knew enough about Coulter Vane to know he wasn't the easiest man to work for. Not cruel, not harsh, just absent. Like he was present in body, but had left some essential part of himself somewhere else. By sunset that same day, Coulter had returned to the ranch and was standing in the barn, checking a mare's shoes, when he heard the sound of wagon wheels on the drive. He straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement. They didn't get visitors. The ranch was too far from town, too isolated, and Coulter had made it clear through 3 years of refusals and silence that he wasn't interested in company, in charity casseroles, in well-meaning invitations to Sunday dinner. But someone was coming up the drive, the wagon wheels crunching on the gravel, raising a plume of dust that caught the last of the sunlight and turned it gold. Coulter walked out of the barn, squinting against the glare. The wagon was old, the wood sun-bleached and splitting. The horse pulling it was older, its head hanging low with exhaustion, and on the driver's seat sat a woman. She pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and sat for a moment, not moving, just looking at the house and the barn and the hard-packed earth as if she were taking inventory, cataloging the place against some internal measure. Then she climbed down, moving with the careful precision of someone who was exhausted but determined not to show it. She was tall, nearly as tall as Coulter's chin, and lean in the way of people who'd missed more meals than they'd eaten. Her dress was dark blue calico, mended in a dozen places, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and hem. Her hair, dark brown and shot through with strands of premature gray, was pulled back in a braid that hung past her shoulders. Her face was angular, all sharp planes and shadows, with high cheekbones and a mouth set in a line that suggested she'd learned early to expect nothing and ask for less. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were gray, storm cloud gray, and they met his directly without flinching or looking away. There was no coyness in that gaze, no calculation, just a level, steady assessment that seemed to see right through him to the cracked foundation underneath. "Mr. Vane?" Her voice was low and clear, roughened slightly by dust and distance. "That's right." He stayed where he was, 15 feet away, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "I saw your notice, in Socorro." She gestured toward the wagon. "I'm here about the cook position." Coulter's gaze moved past her to the wagon, and he felt something inside him go still. There were children in the back, 3 of them. A girl, maybe 12, with the same dark hair as the woman, sitting straight-backed with her hands folded in her lap. A boy, perhaps 10, watching Coulter with eyes that were too old for his face. And a smaller boy, maybe 6, half hidden behind his older brother, peering out with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Coulter looked back at the woman. "You bring your family to a job interview?" "They're part of the arrangement, Mr. Vane." Her chin came up slightly, a small gesture of defiance. "I go where they go. If that's a problem, I'll thank you for your time and move on." There was pride in her voice, pride and desperation in equal measure. Coulter recognized both because he'd heard them in his own voice often enough in the years after his father died, and he'd been left with a failing ranch and no idea how to save it. "What's your name?" he asked. "Willa Hartley." "Mrs. Hartley?" It wasn't really a question. The children made the answer obvious. "Widow." She said it flatly, offering no explanation, no softening, just the fact, laid out plain. Something in Coulter's chest shifted slightly, like a stone settling in a wall. He knew about being a widow, knew about the weight of it, the way it changed how people looked at you, how they spoke to you, either with too much pity or too much distance, never just normal, never just right. "The position is for one person," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "I understand that, Mr. Vane. I'm one person. I can cook, clean, mend, and manage a household. My children won't be a burden. They'll work for their keep. They're good workers, and they're quiet. You'll hardly know they're here." Coulter doubted that. The house had been quiet for 3 years. Children, by definition, weren't quiet. They were noise and chaos and needs that had to be met, questions that had to be answered. They were everything he'd been avoiding. He should say no, should tell her the position was for one person only, send her back to Socorro before the sun finished setting, before he made this mistake. But he looked at the children again, at the girl's straight back and folded hands, at the older boy's 2 old eyes, at the small one's half-hidden face. And he saw what he should have seen immediately. These children were hungry. Not starving, not yet, but heading that direction. Their clothes were too large, taken in with careful stitching. Their faces were clean but gaunt. They sat in the wagon with the absolute stillness of children who'd learned that drawing attention could mean going without. "What happened to your husband?" The question came out more abrupt than he'd intended. Willa Hartley's jaw tightened. "He died. 4 years ago." "How?" "Kick from a horse." She said it without emotion, but her hands, hanging at her sides, curled slightly into fists. "Took him 3 days. I was pregnant with my youngest. He never met his father." Coulter filed that information away. The smallest boy was 6, which meant Willa had been raising 3 children alone for their entire remembered lives. That explained the old eyes on the middle child, the rigid discipline in their posture. They'd learned early that survival meant keeping quiet and staying useful. "Where are you coming from?" "Santa Fe." "Before that, Albuquerque." "Before that?" She shook her head. "Does it matter?" "Might." "Then no, Mr. Vane, it doesn't matter. What matters is I can do the work you need done, and I need the position. If that's not enough, I'll move on." There was steel in her voice now, steel and exhaustion. Coulter recognized that too. He'd heard it in his own voice the day he'd buried Sarah, the day he'd stood in the cemetery and told the well-meaning pastor that no, he didn't need prayers, he needed people to leave him the hell alone. This woman, Willa Hartley, needed work and shelter and a chance to keep her children fed. She wasn't asking for charity or pity. She was asking for fair trade, her labor for his money, and a roof over her family's heads. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. That's what Coulter told himself as he heard his own voice say, "Room's off the kitchen, used to be the housekeeper's quarters, back when my parents ran the place, hasn't been used in years. You'll need to clean it out." Willa Hartley went very still. "Are you offering me the position?" "I'm offering you a trial. 1 week. You cook, clean, keep the house. Your children stay out of the way. At the end of the week, if it's working, we'll talk terms." "What about payment?" $15 a month plus room and board for all 4 of you. It was low. Coulter knew it was low. But it was what he could afford, and from the way Willa's shoulders dropped slightly, releasing tension he hadn't realized she'd been holding, it was more than she'd expected. "That's acceptable," she said. "One more thing," Coulter's voice hardened slightly. "I keep to myself, Mrs. Hartley. I don't need conversation, I don't need company, and I don't need anyone trying to fix anything that isn't broken. You do your work, I'll do mine, and we'll get along fine. Understood?" "Perfectly." Her gray eyes met his again, and this time he saw something like understanding in them. She knew what he was saying. "Stay out of my grief, and I'll stay out of yours. Miguel will show you where everything is. Supper's at 6. Don't make anything fancy." "Yes, sir." Coulter turned and walked back toward the barn, dismissing her without another word. He heard the wagon creak as she climbed back onto the seat, heard the quiet murmur of her voice speaking to her children, heard the horse's hooves as she drove the wagon around to the back of the house. He stood in the barn's shadow and tried to convince himself he hadn't just made a terrible mistake. By the time Coulter came in from the evening feeding, the sun had dropped behind the western mesa, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if he'd been the kind of man who noticed such things anymore. The house, when he approached it, looked different. Light spilled from the kitchen windows, warm and golden. Smoke rose from the chimney, not the thin, grudging smoke of a banked fire, but the steady column of a fire tended by someone who knew what they were doing. And underneath the smell of dust and horse and his own sweat, Coulter caught something else. The scent of food cooking. Real food, not the beans and bacon he'd been living on for months. He paused on the porch, his hand on the door, and felt that strange shifting sensation in his chest again. The house hadn't looked like this, hadn't felt like this, in 3 years. It looked lived in, cared for, like a house instead of just a place to sleep when the day ended. He pushed the door open. The kitchen had been transformed. The floor, which had been gritty with tracked-in dirt, was swept clean. The table, which had been cluttered with old newspapers and unwashed plates, was clear except for a single place setting: plate, fork, knife, cup. The stove, which he'd been meaning to clean for months, gleamed. Even the air felt different, no longer stale and lifeless, but warm with cooking smells and something else. Lemon? Had she found the old lemon oil Sarah used to use on the furniture? Willa Hartley stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring something in a large pot. She'd changed her dress for an apron, worn but clean, and her braid hung down her back like a rope. The children were nowhere in sight. "Mrs. Hartley." She turned, her face composed. "Mr. Vane. Supper's ready. Beef stew, cornbread, and coffee. I found some dried apples in the pantry. I hope you don't mind. I made a small cobbler." Coulter moved to the table slowly, feeling like a stranger in his own house. "Where are your children?" "In our room. They've already eaten. They won't disturb you." She'd worked fast. The housekeeper's room was small, just barely large enough for a bed, a washstand, and a trunk. Fitting 4 people in there would be tight, but she'd managed it. He could hear nothing from behind the closed door. She'd meant what she said about them being quiet. Coulter sat down at the table, and Willa brought the food: a bowl of stew that actually steamed, a piece of cornbread with butter melting into its golden surface, a cup of coffee that smelled like coffee instead of mud. He picked up his spoon and tasted the stew. It was good. Better than good. The meat was tender, the vegetables cooked through but not mushy. The broth rich and seasoned with something he couldn't quite identify, but that made his mouth water. It was the kind of food that reminded him that eating could be something more than just necessary fuel. He was halfway through the bowl before he realized Willa was still standing by the stove, her hands folded in front of her, watching him with that same level, assessing gaze. "Aren't you going to eat?" he asked. "I'll eat after, Mr. Vane, with my children. That's not necessary. There's plenty. I prefer it this way." It wasn't about preference, Coulter realized. It was about boundaries. She was establishing the relationship, employer and employee, not family, not friends. She would cook for him, serve him, maintain his house. But she wouldn't sit at his table. She wouldn't pretend this was anything other than what it was: a business arrangement that allowed her to keep her children fed and him to avoid starving on his own bad cooking. He should have been relieved. It was exactly what he told her he wanted. No conversation, no company, no attempts to fix anything. Instead, he felt a small, unexpected twinge of something that might have been loneliness if he'd been willing to name it. "Suit yourself," he said, and went back to eating. He finished the meal in silence. The stew, the cornbread, the cobbler, all of it good, all of it reminding him of things he'd tried hard to forget. Sarah had been a good cook, back when she was well. The house had always smelled like this, warm and welcoming, a place you wanted to come home to at the end of a long day. He pushed the memories away with practiced efficiency. When he'd finished, Willa came and collected his dishes without a word. He stood, intending to retreat to the small room off the front hall that served as his office and bedroom. He'd moved out of the main bedroom after Sarah died, unable to sleep there anymore. "Mr. Vane?" He turned. Willa stood at the sink, her hands in the dishwater, her back straight. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the chance. We won't disappoint you." Coulter nodded once and left the kitchen before he had to respond. He didn't want her gratitude. Didn't want the weight of being responsible for 4 people's well-being instead of just his own. He'd only offered her a job, nothing more. That's what he told himself. But later, lying on his narrow bed in the office-turned bedroom, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around him, Coulter heard something he hadn't heard in 3 years: the soft murmur of voices from the housekeeper's room, a woman's low tones, a child's whispered question, another child's muffled laugh, quickly shushed, the sound of a family, the sound of life. He lay awake a long time, listening to the house breathe again, and wondered if he'd made a mistake after all. Not because Willa Hartley couldn't do the work, clearly she could, but because the house, so carefully maintained as a monument to absence, was no longer empty. And Coulter Vane wasn't sure he knew how to live in a house that wasn't empty anymore. The first week passed in a kind of suspended routine. Coulter rose before dawn, as he always had, and found coffee already made, the kitchen warm, breakfast set out and covered to keep it hot. He ate alone while Willa and her children stayed in their room, as silent as ghosts. By the time he left for the day's work, they'd emerged. He could hear them moving through the house, Willa's voice giving quiet instructions, the children's footsteps light on the floorboards. He stayed away as much as possible. There was always work on a ranch, fences to mend, cattle to check, horses to exercise. He found reasons to ride to the far pastures, to check the water sources in the canyons, to inventory supplies in the line shack on the northern boundary. Anything to avoid the house and its new inhabitants. But the house had a way of pulling him back. At noon, he'd return to find lunch waiting, sandwiches wrapped in clean cloth, a jar of cold tea, sometimes cookies or cake if Willa had found the ingredients. At dinner, the same pattern, a hot meal, expertly prepared, served in a clean kitchen that no longer felt like a place where hope went to die. And slowly, despite his best efforts to remain detached, Coulter began to notice things. He noticed how Willa moved, efficiently, economically, never wasting motion or energy. She cooked with the confidence of someone who'd been doing it her whole life, measuring ingredients by eye, adjusting heat by instinct. She cleaned with the same quiet competence, working through the house room by room, restoring order to spaces that had fallen into neglect. He noticed the children, though they tried hard not to be noticed. The girl, Lark, he'd learned her name from overhearing Willa, was 12 and already carried herself like someone much older. She helped her mother without being asked, anticipating needs, moving through the house like a shadow. She had her mother's gray eyes and the same careful way of watching the world, as if she were constantly calculating risks and planning escapes. The older boy, Silas, was 10 and had appointed himself the man of the family. He was too serious, too watchful, his thin shoulders carrying a weight that should never have been placed on them. Coulter caught him one morning carrying water from the well, the buckets too heavy for his frame, but refusing to put them down or ask for help. And the youngest, Boone, 6 years old and the only one who sometimes forgot to be invisible. He was curious about everything, his eyes wide as he explored the boundaries of their new home. But whenever Coulter appeared, the boy would freeze like a rabbit that had spotted a hawk, then flee back to his mother's side. They were good children, quiet, disciplined, hard-working, everything Willa had promised, and that bothered Coulter more than he wanted to admit. Children shouldn't be that quiet, that disciplined. They should be loud and messy and asking endless questions. They should be children, not small adults who'd learned that survival meant making themselves invisible. On the fourth day, Coulter came back from the north pasture earlier than usual. One of the mares had thrown a shoe, and he decided to deal with it at the barn rather than in the field. He approached the house quietly, not meaning to eavesdrop, but not announcing himself either. The kitchen window was open to catch the afternoon breeze, and voices drifted out. "Mama, there's eggs in the henhouse." That was Silas, his voice eager in a way Coulter had never heard. "6 of them. Can we keep them?" "Of course we can keep them, sweetheart. That's what hens are for." Willa's voice was warm, full of affection that she kept carefully hidden whenever Coulter was around. "Lark, can you help Silas collect them? Be gentle. We don't want to break any." "Yes, Mama." Lark's voice softer than her mother's, but with the same underlying strength. "What about me?" Boone's voice, high and plaintive. "I want to help." "You can help by setting the table for supper. Can you count to 4? "Yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 3, Boone, 3. "Free!" Willa laughed, a sound so unexpected that Coulter stopped moving entirely. It was a real laugh, unguarded and full of joy, the sound of a woman who loved her children and found pleasure in their presence despite everything life had thrown at them. It was the sound of someone who hadn't given up. Coulter stood frozen outside the window, listening to that laugh, and felt something crack inside him. Some piece of the armor he'd been wearing for 3 years, some carefully maintained distance, split down the middle. This woman had lost her husband, had spent 4 years struggling to keep her children fed and clothed and alive, moving from town to town, taking whatever work she could find, always one bad month away from complete disaster. She had every reason to be bitter, to be broken, to have given up. but she was laughing with her children over eggs in a hen house. Coulter backed away from the window and went to the barn to shoe the mare. His hands shook slightly as he worked, and he told himself it was just fatigue, just the heat, just anything except what it actually was. The first crack in a wall he'd built very carefully to keep himself from feeling anything at all. That evening, when he came in for supper, Willa served him roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread, and green beans that must have come from the garden she'd already started resurrecting. There were eggs, scrambled with cheese, on the side. "The hens are laying again," she said as she set the plate down. "I fixed the hole in the coop wall where the fox was getting in. We should have eggs regularly now." Coulter looked at the food, then at her. "You fixed the coop?" "Yes, sir. Silas helped. He's good with a hammer." "He's 10 years old." "Yes, sir. Old enough to learn." There was something in her voice, not quite challenge, but close, a reminder that her children weren't burdens, that they earned their keep, that she wouldn't accept his charity without giving fair value in return. "I would have fixed it," Coulter said. "I'm sure you would have, Mr. Vane, when you had time. But I had time today, so I took care of it." She went back to the stove, leaving him with his meal and his thoughts. Coulter ate slowly, tasting the chicken, perfectly roasted, the skin crispy and the meat tender, and wondered when he'd lost the ability to accept help. When he'd started seeing every kindness as an intrusion, every offer of assistance as pity in disguise. Probably around the same time he'd stopped tasting food, stopped noticing sunsets, stopped living in anything but the most technical sense of the word. "Mrs. Hartley?" She turned, her eyebrows raised slightly. "Yes, sir?" "The chicken is good, best I've had in years." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening, a brief lowering of the careful guard she kept up around him. "Thank you, Mr. Vane. I'm glad you're pleased." After that, things shifted slightly between them. Not much. Coulter was still the employer and Willa still the employee, and they both maintained appropriate distance. But there was a small crack in the wall now, a tiny opening that let in just enough light to see by. On the 6th day, Coulter came in to find Lark sitting at the kitchen table, carefully mending one of his shirts. Her needle moved with practiced precision, her stitches small and even, the patch she was sewing over a torn elbow barely visible. She looked up when he entered, her eyes widening with alarm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vane. Mama said it was all right to work in here while she's cooking, but if you'd prefer—" "It's fine," Coulter interrupted. He wasn't used to children being afraid of him. He wasn't a harsh man, wasn't cruel, just distant. But to a 12-year-old girl who'd learned that men could be dangerous, distance probably looked a lot like coldness. "That's my work shirt." "Yes, sir. Mama's washing the others. She said this one needed mending first." Coulter moved closer, looking at her work. The stitches were excellent, better than anything he could have done himself. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" "Mama taught me. She used to work as a seamstress sometimes. Before—" Lark trailed off, her face shuddering closed. "Before what?" But Lark just shook her head and went back to her sewing, her shoulders hunching slightly, as if she expected to be punished for not answering. Coulter let it go. Whatever had happened to Willa Hartley before she arrived at his ranch, it had taught her children to be afraid of questions, to guard their past like it was something that could hurt them if revealed. He understood that. He'd been guarding his own past for 3 years now. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for mending the shirt." Lark looked up, surprise clear on her young face. "You're welcome, Mr. Vane." It was a small exchange, barely worth noting, but it was the first real conversation Coulter had had with any of the children, and as he walked away, he realized he'd actually enjoyed it. Lark was smart, careful, and skilled beyond her years. In another life, with different circumstances, she'd probably be in school, learning things beyond sewing and cooking and how to make herself invisible. That night, as Coulter sat in his office going over the ranch accounts, he heard music. It was faint, coming from the housekeeper's room, someone singing, their voice soft and low. Willa, he realized. She was singing to her children, some old ballad he half remembered from his own childhood, back when his mother was still alive and the house had been full of music and laughter. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan. Earth stood hard as iron, water like a stone. The song was melancholy, beautiful in its sadness. Willa's voice was untrained but true, carrying the melody with simple grace. Coulter found himself setting down his pen, just listening, letting the music wash over him. It had been so long since there was music in this house, so long since there was anything but silence and emptiness and the sound of his own footsteps echoing in rooms that no longer held any life. When the song ended, Coulter sat in the darkness of his office and realized something he'd been trying very hard not to acknowledge. He didn't want Willa Hartley and her children to leave. The week was almost up. Tomorrow he'd have to make a decision. Keep them on permanently or send them back to Socorro with a week's wages and a recommendation letter. The smart thing would be to let them go. They were making the house too alive, too warm, too much like a home instead of just a place to sleep between days of work. They were making him remember things he'd tried very hard to forget, what it felt like to come home to someone, to share meals, to have voices in the house besides his own. They were making him feel things, and feeling things was dangerous because feeling things meant you could be hurt again. But the alternative was going back to the silence, going back to cold coffee and burnt bacon and the kind of loneliness that ate away at you from the inside like rot in a tree, invisible, until the whole structure came crashing down. Coulter sat in his office until late into the night, the lamp burning low, the house quiet around him except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of wind in the canyon. And he made his decision. On the 7th morning, Coulter came into the kitchen at dawn to find Willa already awake, kneading bread dough with steady, methodical movements. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the tension in her shoulders, the careful neutrality of her expression. She knew what day it was, knew he'd be making his decision. "Mrs. Hartley." Coulter poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made, buying time. "Been meaning to talk to you." "Yes, sir." Her hand stilled in the dough, but she didn't look at him. "About the week. About the arrangement." He took a breath, surprised to find he was nervous. When had he last been nervous about anything? "If you're willing, I'd like to make it permanent. Same terms, $15 a month, room and board for all 4 of you." Willa's hands resumed their movement, kneading the dough with perhaps slightly more force than necessary. "That's acceptable, Mr. Vane. Thank you." Her voice was carefully level, but Coulter caught the slight tremor underneath. Relief, he realized. She'd been afraid he'd send them away, send them back out onto the road with nothing but a week's wages and nowhere to go. "There's one condition," he added. Willa's hands stilled again. "Sir?" "Your boy, Silas, he's good with his hands, you said. If he's interested, Miguel could teach him ranch work. Nothing dangerous, just fence mending, basic animal care, that kind of thing. He'd be paid, same as the other hands. Not full wages, but fair for his age and experience." This time Willa did look at him, her gray eyes wide with surprise. "You'd pay him?" "He'd be working. Of course I'd pay him." Yes, I think he'd like that very much. Thank you, Mr. Vane." Coulter nodded once and retreated with his coffee before the conversation could get any more complicated. But as he left, he caught sight of Willa's reflection in the window glass. She was smiling, a real smile, unguarded and full of something that looked like hope. It made something warm unfurl in his chest, something he'd thought had died with Sarah. Not attraction, exactly. Not yet, just recognition. The understanding that this woman, who'd been through hell and come out the other side still fighting, still protecting her children, still able to smile, she was strong. Stronger than he'd been, maybe. She hadn't given up, hadn't let her grief turn her into a ghost haunting her own life. Maybe, Coulter thought as he headed out to start the day's work, maybe it was time he stopped haunting his life too. The sun was rising over the eastern mesa, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was cool, the heat of the day still an hour away. Somewhere in the distance, a canyon wren sang its descending song, clear and pure. Coulter stopped to listen, really listen, for the first time in 3 years. And from the house behind him came the sound of Willa's voice, calling her children to breakfast, and the children's answering laughter, and the clatter of dishes, and the smell of bread baking. The sound of life returning to a place that had forgotten how to live. Coulter stood in his yard, his coffee growing cold in his hand, listening to the house breathe and sing and wake up. And he thought, Maybe this won't be so bad after all. Maybe this is exactly what the house needed. What he needed, though he'd never admit it out loud. A reason to come home at the end of the day. The weeks that followed became a rhythm Coulter hadn't known he was capable of finding again. He woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, ate breakfast in a kitchen that gleamed with care, and headed out to work with something that felt dangerously close to contentment settling in his chest. The ranch hummed along as it always had, but now there were small differences. A mended gate he hadn't gotten around to fixing, wildflowers in a jar on the porch, the garden plot behind the house suddenly green with sprouting vegetables. Willa moved through the house like water finding its level, claiming space without asking permission, making decisions without seeking approval. She reorganized the pantry, discovering supplies Coulter had forgotten he owned. She patched the roof where it leaked in the corner of the front room. She convinced Miguel to help her repair the pump at the well, and suddenly there was water pressure again, enough for a proper bath instead of the cold wash Coulter had been making do with. The house was transforming around him, becoming something he barely recognized. But it wasn't just the physical changes that unsettled him. It was the way the place felt different, alive, inhabited. Like it had remembered it was supposed to be a home, and not just a structure to keep the rain off. Silas started working with Miguel 3 mornings a week, his thin shoulders squaring with pride every time he mastered a new skill. The boy had good hands and better instincts, never rushing a spooked horse, never forcing a stubborn knot. Miguel, who rarely spoke more than necessary, started talking more when Silas was around, sharing stories from his own youth in Mexico, teaching the boy not just ranch work but the philosophy behind it, patience, respect for the animals, understanding that most problems solve themselves if you just waited them out. Coulter watched the boy grow in confidence, saw him start to stand straighter, laugh more freely. The 2 old eyes were still there, but they were softening around the edges, letting in the possibility that maybe the world wasn't entirely dangerous. Maybe there was room for a 10-year-old to actually be 10. Lark continued her quiet campaign to make herself indispensable. She could sew better than anyone Coulter had ever known. Her stitches invisible, her patches seamless. She helped her mother with the cooking, learning to judge the heat of the oven by holding her hand inside for a count of 3, measuring flour by the handful with perfect consistency. She read to Boone at night, her voice carrying through the thin walls, fairy tales, Bible stories, whatever books she could find in the dusty bookshelf in the front room that Coulter hadn't touched since Sarah died. And Boone, young enough to not have learned complete caution yet, started venturing out of the housekeeper's room during the day. Coulter would catch glimpses of him in the yard, playing with sticks and rocks, constructing elaborate worlds that only existed in his imagination. The boy still fled whenever Coulter appeared, but the terror was fading into simple wariness. Progress, Coulter supposed, though it bothered him more than he wanted to admit that a 6-year-old would have any reason to fear grown men. It was Willa, though, who occupied more of Coulter's thoughts than he was comfortable acknowledging. She was a constant presence in the house, yet somehow never intrusive. She anticipated his needs without hovering, maintained appropriate distance without coldness. She was exactly what he'd asked for, efficient, competent, invisible when he wanted to be alone. But he was starting to notice things he shouldn't be noticing. The way she moved through the kitchen, her hands sure and graceful. The way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way her face softened when she looked at her children, all the hardness and wariness melting into pure maternal love. The sound of her voice in the evening, singing those old ballads, turning the house into something that felt like sanctuary. He told himself it didn't matter. Told himself she was his employee, nothing more, and any thoughts beyond that were inappropriate and unwelcome. She'd given no indication she saw him as anything other than her employer, distant, damaged, better left alone, which was exactly how he wanted it, had to be how he wanted it, because the alternative was unthinkable. One evening in late July, nearly 6 weeks after Willa and her children had arrived, Coulter came in from a particularly brutal day to find the kitchen empty. No Willa at the stove, no smell of cooking, no signs of preparation. The house was quiet in a way that immediately set his nerves on edge. Not the peaceful quiet of evening, but the tense quiet of something wrong. He moved through the house quickly, checking rooms. The housekeeper's room door was closed. He knocked. "Mrs. Hartley." A long pause, then Lark's voice, carefully controlled. Mama's not feeling well, Mr. Vane. She asked me to tell you she's sorry about supper. Coulter stood on the other side of the door, his hand still raised from knocking. In 6 weeks, Willa had never missed a meal, never failed to complete a task, never shown any weakness or vulnerability. She carried her burdens silently, never complaining, never asking for help, which meant whatever was wrong was serious enough that she couldn't hide it. What's wrong with her? He asked through the door. Another pause, then quieter. She won't say, but she's been sick all day. Sick could mean 1,000 things, from a simple cold to something much worse. Coulter thought about just walking away, letting Willa handle her own problems. She was a grown woman, after all, and he'd made it clear he didn't want involvement in her personal life. But the thought of her suffering in silence, trying to hide illness from her children to avoid worrying them, trying to hide it from him to avoid seeming weak, it bothered him more than it should have. "I'm coming in," he said. "Mr. Vane, I don't think—" He opened the door before Lark could finish her protest. The small room was dim, lit only by a single lamp turned low. All 3 children were there, Lark sitting on the edge of the bed, Silas standing against the wall looking worried, Boone curled in the corner with his thumb in his mouth, a habit Coulter had never seen him display before. And on the bed, propped against the wall because there wasn't enough room for pillows, Willa lay with her eyes closed, her face pale and drawn, a sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the evening cool. Coulter crossed to the bed in 3 strides. "Mrs. Hartley." Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on him with difficulty. "Mr. Vane, I apologize. I'll have supper ready in just a moment. I just need to—" She tried to sit up, swayed, and would have fallen if Coulter hadn't caught her shoulders. "You're not cooking anything," he said firmly. "How long have you been sick?" "I'm not sick, just a headache. I'll be fine." "Mama's been throwing up since this morning," Silas said quietly from his position against the wall. His voice was steady, but his eyes were frightened. "And she fainted when she tried to do the washing." Willa shot her son a look that might have been reproachful if she'd had the strength for it. "Silas, I told you not to worry, Mr. Vane with—" "When did you last eat?" Coulter interrupted. She blinked at him, confused by the question. This morning. Maybe. I don't remember." "And before that?" "I don't see what— Before that, Mrs. Hartley? When did you last have a proper meal?" She looked away, her jaw setting stubbornly. "I've been eating." "Not enough," Lark said softly. "Mama always makes sure we eat, but she—" The girl trailed off, her eyes filling with tears she was too proud to let fall. "She gives us her portions, says she's not hungry." Something hot and sharp twisted in Coulter's gut. He'd been paying Willa $15 a month plus room and board, but the board was only what she cooked. If she was giving her food to her children and pretending she wasn't hungry, she'd been essentially starving herself for 6 weeks while working herself to exhaustion keeping his house and cooking his meals. And he hadn't noticed, hadn't paid attention, had been too wrapped up in his own carefully maintained distance to see that the woman working for him was literally making herself sick to keep her children fed. "Lark," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended, "go to the kitchen. Make your mother some broth. There's beef bones in the cold box and vegetables. Not a full stew, just something light. Silas, go with her and help. Boone—" He looked at the small boy still curled in the corner. "Can you stay here and keep your mama company?" Boone nodded mutely, his thumb still in his mouth. Lark and Silas left quickly, clearly relieved to have something to do, some way to help. Coulter turned back to Willa, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Embarrassment, maybe, or anger at being exposed as needing help. "You should have said something," he told her. "I'm managing fine." "You fainted doing the washing. That's not managing fine." "I just need to rest. I'll be back to work tomorrow." "No, you won't." Coulter sat down on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her. "You'll stay in bed until you've recovered. The house won't fall apart for a few days." "Mr. Vane, that's not acceptable. You hired me to—" "I hired you to cook and keep house, not work yourself to death." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Why didn't you tell me the food wasn't enough?" Willa looked away, her hands twisting in the thin blanket covering her. "It's enough. More than enough. I'm just not good at managing it, that's all. I'll do better. Mrs. Hartley. Coulter waited until she looked at him again. You're feeding 4 people on provisions meant for 1. That's not poor management, that's basic mathematics. Why didn't you say something? She was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether honesty would be punished. Finally, she said, because you'd think we were taking advantage, that we were more trouble than we're worth, and you'd send us away. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. She'd been willing to starve herself rather than risk losing the first stable situation she'd found in 4 years, rather than risk her children going hungry, rather than appear to be anything other than the perfect, uncomplaining employee who caused no problems and required no special consideration. Coulter felt something shift inside him, some last wall of intentional indifference crumbling under the weight of recognition. He knew what it was like to be that afraid of losing something, that desperate to maintain control even as everything fell apart around you. He'd felt it when Sarah got sick, when he tried to convince himself that if he just worked harder, prayed more, did everything right, she'd get better, as if willpower alone could stop death. You're not getting sent away, he said quietly. But starting tomorrow, provisions double. And you eat at the same time as your children, not after. Understood? Willa's eyes filled with tears, the first sign of real emotion he'd seen from her beyond that single laugh through the window weeks ago. Mr. Vane, you don't have to— Yes, I do. You work for me, which means your welfare is my responsibility. Should have realized sooner that one person's provisions weren't going to stretch to 4. That's my fault, not yours. It's not your responsibility to— Mrs. Hartley. He stopped her with a raised hand. Don't argue. You're sick, you're exhausted, and you need to rest. Let me do this one thing without fighting me on it. She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her trying to decide whether to trust this offer, whether to believe it wasn't some kind of trap. Then, slowly, she nodded. Thank you, she whispered. Coulter stood, suddenly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment, sitting on her bed, seeing her vulnerable and afraid, knowing more about her situation than their careful employer-employee relationship should allow. I'll check on the broth. You rest. He was at the door when her voice stopped him. Mr. Vane, why are you being kind to us? It was a question that shouldn't have needed asking, but Coulter understood why she asked it. Kindness, in her experience, probably came with strings attached, probably meant someone wanted something in return, probably meant vulnerability that could be exploited. Because it's the decent thing to do, he said simply. And because— He paused, then decided to be honest. Because you've made this house feel like a home again. That's worth more than the $15 a month I'm paying you. Worth feeding you properly, at the very least. He left before she could respond, before the moment could stretch into something even more complicated. In the kitchen, Lark and Silas were working together to make broth, their movements synchronized through long practice. Lark was cutting vegetables into tiny pieces, while Silas stirred the pot, his face serious with concentration. How's Mama? Lark asked without looking up from her work. She'll be fine, just needs rest and proper food. Coulter poured himself coffee from the pot that was always ready, always fresh. How long has she been skipping meals? The siblings exchanged glances, that wordless communication of children who'd learned to protect each other and their mother from the world. Finally, Silas said, Since we got here. Maybe before. She always makes sure we eat first, says she's not hungry, or she ate earlier, or she'll eat later. But she doesn't, Lark finished. Her knife work never slowed, each piece of carrot perfectly uniform. She thinks we don't notice, but we do. Coulter sat down at the table, suddenly exhausted. Why didn't you tell me? Because Mama would be angry if she knew we said anything, Lark said simply, and because we were afraid you'd think we weren't worth keeping if we caused trouble. There it was again, that fear of being too much trouble, of being sent away, of losing the fragile security they'd found. Coulter wondered what they'd been through before arriving at his ranch, what experiences had taught these children that their needs were negotiable, that staying quiet and invisible was the price of survival. Listen to me, he said, waiting until both children looked at him. You're not going anywhere. Neither is your mother. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be. And you're not too much trouble. You're barely any trouble at all, which is actually the problem. You're allowed to need things. Understand? Lark's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. Yes, sir. Good. Now let's get that broth finished. And tomorrow I'm riding into Socorro for more supplies. I want you two to make a list of everything you actually need. Food, clothes, whatever. Don't hold back. If you need it, write it down. Mr. Vane, we can't afford... Silas started. It's not about what you can afford. You work for your keep, you and your mother both. You've more than earned it. He stood, finishing his coffee. I'll sit with your mother while you two eat. Make sure she actually swallows the broth instead of trying to give it away. He returned to the housekeeper's room with a cup of water to find Willa exactly where he'd left her, Boone now curled up beside her on the narrow bed, his small body pressed against her side. She had one arm around him, her fingers carding through his hair with automatic maternal tenderness. He's asleep, she murmured as Coulter entered. Poor thing was so worried. He's not the only one. Coulter set the water down on the small table beside the bed. Your other two are finishing the broth. They'll bring it in when it's ready. You don't have to stay. I know you prefer to keep to yourself. I'm staying until you've eaten something. He pulled over the room's single chair and sat down. Otherwise, you'll convince Lark to give it to Boone, or save it for later, or some other excuse. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. You figured us out, then. Some. Enough to know you're all too good at taking care of everyone except yourselves. Willa looked down at Boone's sleeping face, her expression softening. They're all I have, Mr. Vane. Everything I do is to keep them safe, fed, alive. That means I go hungry sometimes. She shrugged. It's a small price. It's not sustainable. You collapse? Who takes care of them then? I won't collapse. I'm stronger than I look. I don't doubt your strength, Mrs. Hartley. I doubt your judgment when it comes to your own welfare. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You can't pour from an empty cup. If you destroy yourself trying to care for them, you're not helping anyone. She was quiet for a moment, her hand still moving through Boone's hair. Then softly, you sound like you're speaking from experience. Coulter hadn't meant to reveal anything personal, but he supposed turnabout was fair play. If he was demanding honesty from her, he could offer some in return. My wife died 3 years ago. Consumption. Took her 6 months. I spent that whole time trying to be strong for her, trying to keep the ranch running, trying to convince myself that if I just worked hard enough, prayed hard enough, wanted it badly enough, she'd get better. He paused. She died anyway. And I learned that destroying yourself trying to save someone else doesn't actually save them. It just means you're both destroyed. Willa's gray eyes were luminous in the lamplight. I'm sorry. About your wife. Sarah. Her name was Sarah. Sarah, Willa repeated softly. That's a beautiful name. They sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd both learned the hard way that love couldn't protect against loss, that wanting something desperately didn't make it happen, that sometimes the world took things from you and didn't care how much it hurt. What was she like? Willa asked. Coulter considered not answering. He hadn't talked about Sarah to anyone since the funeral, hadn't allowed himself to remember her beyond the basic fact of her absence. But something about this moment, the dim lamplight, the sleeping child, the honest exhaustion in Willa's eyes, made him want to answer. Kind, he said finally. She was kind in a way that most people aren't, saw the best in everyone even when there wasn't much best to see. She could make friends with a rattlesnake if she had a mind to. He smiled slightly at the memory. Used to drive me crazy, the way she'd invite every drifter and traveling preacher to dinner. I'd come in from the range to find half the town in my kitchen, and Sarah laughing in the middle of it all like she'd planned a party instead of just offering hospitality to whoever needed it. You miss her, Willa said. It wasn't a question. Every day, but... He hesitated, then pushed forward. These past weeks, with you and your children here, it's been easier. The house doesn't feel as empty. The silence doesn't weigh as much. So thank you for that. Willa looked like she wanted to say something, but before she could, Lark appeared in the doorway with a bowl of steaming broth, Silas right behind her carrying a spoon and napkin. "It's ready, Mama," Lark said softly. Coulter stood. "I'll let you eat in peace, but I'll be checking later to make sure that bowl's empty." "Yes, sir," Willa said, and there was something in her voice, warmth, maybe, or gratitude, or the beginning of trust. He left her with her children and went out to the porch, breathing in the night air, trying to process the unexpected intimacy of the last hour. He'd revealed more about himself in that conversation than he had to anyone in 3 years. And instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable, he just felt lighter, like some pressure he hadn't known he was carrying had released slightly. The stars were coming out, brilliant against the darkening sky. A coyote called from the canyon, lonely and wild. The desert at night was a different world from the desert by day, cooler, softer, full of secrets and shadows. Coulter stood on his porch and thought about empty cups and sustainable sacrifice, and the difference between strength and stubbornness. Thought about Willa Hartley, who'd been willing to starve herself for her children, and how that was both admirable and deeply foolish. Thought about how much she reminded him of himself. Too proud to ask for help, too determined to handle everything alone. Too afraid that needing something meant being weak. He'd have to watch her more carefully now. Make sure she was actually eating, actually resting, actually letting herself be human instead of just a machine designed to serve others. It would mean paying more attention, being more involved, crossing some of the careful boundaries he'd established. It would mean caring, which he'd been trying very hard not to do. But looking at the warm light spilling from the kitchen window, hearing the soft murmur of voices from inside, Willa's children helping her eat, teasing her gently, their worry transforming into relief, Coulter realized he'd already crossed that line somewhere along the way. He already cared about Willa, about her children, about whether they were happy and healthy and safe. The question now was what he was going to do about it. The answer, he supposed, would have to wait for morning. For now, he had a ranch to run, supplies to order, and a household to feed properly. The complicated feelings could sort themselves out later. Or so he told himself as he stood on the porch under the rising stars, listening to the house breathe and sing behind him. No longer empty, no longer silent, no longer just a monument to grief, but something beginning to resemble hope. The supplies arrived 3 days later, 2 full wagon loads that made Willa's eyes go wide when she saw them being unloaded. Flour and sugar in quantities she'd probably never seen in one place. Salt pork and dried beans, canned goods and fresh vegetables, coffee and tea and luxuries like chocolate and dried fruit that made the children stare in wonder. Coulter had also included bolts of fabric, sturdy cotton for everyday wear, softer calico for Sunday clothes, and leather for new boots because he'd noticed the children's shoes were held together mostly by hope and careful stitching. Willa had tried to protest, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands twisted in her apron, but Coulter had cut her off before she could start. "You work for me, you're outfitted properly. End of discussion." She'd looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. Then she'd simply nodded and turned back to help her children sort through the supplies, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness as she explained what they'd use for what meals, how the fabric would be cut and sewn, how they'd need to be careful not to waste anything. Always careful. Always conscious that abundance could disappear as quickly as it arrived. Always preparing for the next loss, the next hardship, the next time the world decided to take something away. Coulter understood that mindset. He'd lived it himself after his father died and left him with a failing ranch and debts he'd spent 5 years paying off. The difference was that Willa had been living it for 4 years with 3 children depending on her, moving from town to town, taking whatever work she could find, always one bad month away from complete disaster. The fact that she was still fighting, still hopeful, still capable of laughing with her children over a bolt of blue calico, that spoke to a strength Coulter was only beginning to appreciate. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Willa recovered her health quickly once she was eating properly, color returning to her face, energy to her movements. She cooked with obvious pleasure now, no longer rationing every ingredient like it might be the last, experimenting with recipes she remembered from better times. The kitchen became the heart of the house, always warm, always smelling of something good, always ready to welcome whoever needed food or comfort or just a place to sit for a while. Silas continued working with Miguel, and the bond between the old ranch hand and the young boy deepened into something like family. Miguel taught him to read horse behavior, to spot lameness before it became serious, to mend tack and treat minor injuries. But more than that, he taught him that being a man didn't mean never showing weakness, never asking for help, never admitting when something was too heavy to carry alone. Lessons. Coulter wished someone had taught him at Silas's age, before he'd spent decades trying to be strong enough to handle everything himself. Lark blossomed in quieter ways. She took over the garden entirely, coaxing vegetables from soil that had been neglected for years, her patient hands somehow convincing reluctant plants to grow despite the harsh sun and limited water. She read voraciously, working her way through the dusty books in the front room, poetry and history, and novels that transported her somewhere beyond the New Mexico desert. And she watched her mother with protective awareness, ready to step in whenever Willa pushed herself too hard, ready to take over tasks before they needed doing. Too responsible for 12, Coulter thought. But then again, children who'd survived what these three had survived grew up fast. They didn't have the luxury of childhood innocence, of believing the world was safe, and parents were invulnerable, and tomorrow would definitely come. Boone, young enough to still believe in possibilities, slowly came out of his shell. He started venturing farther from the house, exploring the barn and the corrals, watching the horses with fascinated eyes. He still fled whenever Coulter appeared, but the terror had faded to cautious uncertainty. Progress, even if it was slow. One evening in early August, Coulter was in the barn checking on a mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg when he heard small footsteps behind him. He turned to find Boone standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the sunset, his small hands clenched at his sides like he was gathering courage. Coulter stayed very still, instinct telling him that any sudden movement would send the boy running. "Hey there, Boone." The boy didn't answer, just stood frozen in the doorway. "You looking for something?" Coulter kept his voice low and easy, the tone he'd use with a spooked horse. Boone shook his head, then nodded, then shook his head again, clearly conflicted. "It's all right. You can come in if you want. Or stay there. Either way's fine." After a long moment, Boone took 3 careful steps into the barn, his eyes huge in his small face. "Is the horse sick?" It was the first time the boy had spoken directly to him. Coulter felt something warm unfold in his chest. "Just a little sore. Nothing serious. Want to see?" Boone nodded, creeping closer with the wariness of a wild animal approaching a potential threat. When he was close enough, Coulter gestured to the mare's leg. "See how she's not putting full weight on it? That means something hurts. So we check her hoof first, make sure there's no stone or thorn. Then we check the leg for swelling or heat. Feel here." He guided Boone's small hand to the mare's leg, keeping his own hand underneath to catch the boy if he spooked. "Feel how it's a little warm? That means inflammation. So we'll wrap it tonight, give her some liniment, and by morning she'll be better." "Will she be scared?" Boone asked, his hand still on the mare's leg. "Of the medicine?" "Maybe a little. But we'll be gentle, and we'll talk to her while we work. Let her know we're trying to help. Sometimes that's all you can do. Be gentle, and let them know you're not going to hurt them." Boone considered this seriously. Then, so quietly, Coulter almost missed it. "My papa wasn't gentle." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Coulter kept his hand steady on Boone's, kept his voice calm. "Your papa who died when you were a baby?" "No, Mama's husband. He died before I was born. But there was another papa after, in Santa Fe." Boone's voice was matter-of-fact, a child reciting information he didn't fully understand. "He yelled a lot, and sometimes he hit Mama. And then there was a fire and we had to leave, and Mama said we'd never see him again." Coulter felt something cold and sharp settle in his gut. The pieces were starting to come together. Willa's wariness around men, the children's fear of drawing attention, the way they'd all learned to make themselves invisible. There had been someone after her husband died, someone who'd hurt her, hurt them. And they'd fled, probably in the middle of the night, probably with nothing but what they could carry, probably scared for their lives. "Your mama was right," Coulter said carefully. "You won't see him again. You're safe here." "Promise?" Boone looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much for 6 years old. "Promise."
Nobody's going to hurt you or your mama or your brother and sister. Not while you're on this ranch.
Boone studied his face for a long moment, measuring the truth of that statement with the instincts of a child who'd learned early that adults didn't always keep their promises. Then, apparently satisfied, he nodded and turned his attention back to the mare. "Can I help with the medicine?" "Sure. Go get that jar on the shelf there, the one that says liniment, and bring those bandages." They worked together in the dimming light, Coulter showing Boone how to apply the liniment with gentle circular motions, how to wrap the bandage snug but not too tight, how to talk to the mare in low, soothing tones so she knew they meant no harm. The boy was careful and patient, his small hands surprisingly capable, his concentration absolute. When they finished, Boone stood back and admired their work. "She looks better already." "She will be better by morning. Good job, Boone." The boy beamed at the praise, his whole face transforming from wary to radiant. Then, before Coulter could react, Boone darted forward and wrapped his arms around Coulter's leg in a brief, fierce hug before running out of the barn toward the house, his footsteps light and quick. Coulter stood frozen, staring after him, something painful and sweet expanding in his chest. It was such a simple thing, a child's hug, spontaneous and trusting. But it meant Boone had decided he was safe, that he could be trusted, that he was someone worth hugging instead of someone to fear. When had Coulter last been trusted like that? When had anyone looked at him and seen someone worth approaching instead of someone better left alone? He finished up in the barn slowly, checking the other horses, making sure everything was secure for the night. By the time he walked back to the house, full dark had fallen and the stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way a river of light across the black sky. The kitchen was bright and warm when he entered. Willa stood at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven. Lark sat at the table, reading aloud from a book of poetry, while Silas carved a piece of wood into some shape only he could see yet. And Boone, still flushed with excitement, was setting the table, counting under his breath to make sure he got all 4 places correct. They all looked up when Coulter entered, and for just a moment the scene was so perfectly domestic, so completely normal, that it hurt. This was what family looked like. This was what home felt like. And for 3 years he'd been living in this house without either, just going through the motions, waiting for something he couldn't name. "Mr. Vane," Willa said, turning from the stove. "Boone said you let him help with the mare." "He did good work, natural hand with horses." Boone's chest puffed up with pride. "I wasn't even scared." "You were very brave," Willa agreed, her eyes finding Coulter's over her son's head. In that look was gratitude, understanding, and something else. A question, maybe, or an acknowledgement that something was changing between them. The careful boundaries they'd maintained starting to blur. Coulter looked away first, uncomfortable with the intimacy of that shared glance. "I'll wash up." Dinner that night was louder than usual. Boone couldn't stop talking about the mare, about the liniment and the bandages, and how she'd gotten better because he'd helped. Silas told a story about a particularly stubborn calf he and Miguel had worked with that day. Lark shared a poem she'd read, something about wildflowers and survival that seemed to resonate with Willa, who smiled and nodded and looked at her daughter with such fierce pride it was almost painful to witness. And Coulter sat at the head of the table, eating Willa's excellent stew, listening to the children's chatter, watching this family that wasn't his, but that had somehow become part of his life anyway. He should have felt like an intruder in this moment, an outsider looking in on something that didn't belong to him. But instead, he just felt present. Like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to be doing, which was sitting at this table in this house with these people who'd brought it back to life. After dinner, Coulter retreated to his office, as he always did, leaving Willa and the children to their evening routine. He tried to focus on the account books, on the plans for fall roundup, on the 1,000 details that kept a ranch running, but he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to Boone's hug, to Willa's eyes across the kitchen, to the sound of laughter filling rooms that had been silent for so long. He was still sitting there, staring at numbers that refused to make sense, when a knock came at the door. "Come in," Willa entered, carrying a cup of coffee. "Thought you might want this. You looked lost in thought at dinner." "Just working on accounts, thank you." He took the coffee, and their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange.
He told himself the spark he felt was just static from the dry air. Willa didn't leave immediately. She stood in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her apron, clearly wanting to say something but not sure how to start. "Something on your mind, Mrs. Hartley?" "Boone told me what you said, about keeping us safe, about promises." She paused. "I want you to know I appreciate it, more than I can say. It's just the truth. You're under my roof, which means you're under my protection. Simple as that. It's not simple, though. Not for us." She took a breath, and Coulter could see her gathering courage to reveal something she'd kept hidden. "My husband died when Boone was still growing inside me. For a while I managed. I took in sewing, washing, whatever work I could find, but it wasn't enough. Never enough. And then I met a man in Santa Fe who seemed kind, who said he'd help, who promised he'd take care of us. The one Boone mentioned, the one who hit you." Willa's jaw tightened. "He was charming at first, sweet, said all the right things, but after a few months, when he was sure I depended on him, he changed. Started drinking, started gambling, started coming home angry and looking for someone to blame." She touched her arm unconsciously, and Coulter wondered what scars were hidden under her sleeves. "I tried to leave several times, but he always found us, said I owed him, that I'd let him on, that I was his property now." "You're not property. You never were." "I know that now, but back then, I was just trying to survive, trying to keep my children safe. And then one night he came home drunk and violent, and there was a fight, and a lamp got knocked over." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The whole place went up, saloon above, boarding rooms below. We got out, but others didn't, and people said I'd started it, that I was a scarlet woman who'd seduced a good man and then burned his business down when he tried to make me honest. That's not what happened." "No. But truth doesn't matter when people want to believe the worst." She looked at him directly, her gray eyes fierce. "So I took my children and we ran. Came here to New Mexico territory, where nobody knew us, where we could start fresh. And then I saw your notice, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this could be the place where we finally stopped running." Coulter set down his coffee cup carefully. "You're done running. This is your home now, for as long as you want it. Nobody's going to take that from you." "You say that now, but if people in Socorro find out about Santa Fe, about the fire, about the things people said, then they can mind their own damn business." His voice came out harder than intended. "You're not responsible for what some violent drunk did. You're not responsible for what some gossiping fools said about it. And anyone who has a problem with you having work and shelter will have to go through me first." Willa's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Why? Why do you care what happens to us?" It was the same question she'd asked weeks ago when he'd sat beside her bed and promised to feed her properly. And Coulter still didn't have a good answer, or at least not one he was ready to speak aloud. Because caring about her children, meant opening himself up to the possibility of loss again, meant investing in something that could be taken away, meant feeling things he'd sworn he was done feeling. But sitting here in his office, looking at this woman who'd survived things that would have broken most people, who'd kept her children safe and whole despite impossible odds, who'd walked into his life and transformed his house from a tomb into a home, he couldn't lie to her. Couldn't pretend he didn't care when it was becoming increasingly obvious that he did. "Because you remind me that strength isn't about never falling down," he said finally. "It's about getting back up. And you've gotten back up more times than anyone should have to. That deserves respect, deserves support, deserves someone in your corner instead of always fighting alone." Willa stood very still, processing his words. Then, quietly, "Thank you for seeing me, for seeing us, for giving us a chance when you didn't have to. You've more than earned it." She nodded once, then turned to leave. But at the doorway she paused and looked back. "Mr. Vane? Sarah was lucky to have you. I hope she knew that." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with his cold coffee and the echo of her words. Sarah had known. At least, he hoped she had. He'd tried to be a good husband, tried to give her everything she needed, tried to make her happy. But in the end, none of it had mattered.
Love hadn't been enough to save her, and all his trying had just meant he'd watched helplessly while she slipped away. He didn't want to feel that helpless again. Didn't want to care about someone so much that losing them would destroy him. But looking at the doorway where Willa had stood, remembering the way her voice had cracked when she thanked him, the way her eyes had shone with unshed tears, he realized it might already be too late. He already cared, already felt protective, possessive even, of this family that had arrived on his doorstep with nothing and had somehow given him back something he'd thought was lost forever. The ability to feel, to hope, to imagine a future that included something more than just endless days of empty routine. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and Coulter didn't know what to do with any of it except sit in his office and try not to think about how Willa's eyes had looked in the lamplight, how her voice had sounded when she'd called Sarah lucky, how much he wanted to promise her things he had no business promising. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching August day. Coulter rose early and headed out to check the north pasture fence line, something he'd been putting off for weeks. It was hard work, hot and tedious, requiring miles of riding and careful examination of every post and wire. But it needed doing, and it would keep him away from the house, from Willa, from the complicated feelings he was trying very hard not to examine too closely. He'd made it about 6 miles out, deep in canyon country where the land folded into shadows and secrets, when he heard the sound that made every rancher's blood run cold. Distant gunfire. 3 shots in quick succession, then a pause, then 2 more. Could be hunters. Could be someone dealing with a rattlesnake or injured animal. Could be nothing at all. But the shots had come from the direction of the ranch, and Coulter was already wheeling his horse around, already kicking into a gallop, already running through possibilities in his mind and not liking any of them. The ride back seemed to take forever, his horse's hooves pounding the hard earth, the sun beating down mercilessly. More shots echoed across the canyon. Pistol fire, definitely, not a rifle. Someone shooting at something moving, missing more than hitting. Coulter crested the ridge above the ranch and saw the scene below, and his heart stopped. 3 men on horses in the yard, circling like wolves. Miguel was down, lying too still near the corral fence. Tom and Davies were nowhere in sight, either fled or dead. And standing in the doorway of the house, blocking the entrance with her body, was Willa Hartley. She held a rifle, Coulter's old Winchester that he kept above the kitchen door, and she was pointing it directly at the closest rider. Behind her, Coulter could see the shapes of her children, huddled together in the doorway she was defending. The rider was laughing, his pistol hanging loose in his hand, clearly not taking the threat seriously. Why would he? She was just a woman, probably didn't even know how to use that rifle, probably would faint at the first sign of real violence. He didn't know Willa Hartley. Coulter was already moving, already pulling his own rifle from its saddle scabbard, already calculating angles and distances, and the best way to end this without anyone else getting hurt. He was still too far away for an accurate shot, especially from horseback. He needed to get closer. One of the riders noticed him coming, shouted a warning. The others turned, and in that moment of distraction, Willa pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. She was shaking too badly to aim properly, but it made her point. She wasn't going to let them in the house. Wasn't going to let them near her children. Would die in that doorway before she'd surrender. The rider who'd been laughing wasn't laughing anymore. He raised his pistol, no longer playing, and Coulter felt something primal and fierce tear through him. He pushed his horse harder, closing the distance, bringing his rifle up even though the range was still too far, even though shooting from a galloping horse was next to impossible, even though he might hit Willa instead of the bandit. But he had to try. Had to stop this. Had to protect what was his. And when had he started thinking of Willa and her children as his? No time to examine that now. He squeezed the trigger and felt the rifle kick against his shoulder. The shot missed, kicking up dust 5 feet from the riders. But it got their attention, made them realize this wasn't 3 defenseless people and an old ranch hand. There was someone coming who knew how to shoot and wasn't afraid to do it. The leader, the one who'd been about to shoot Willa, wheeled his horse around. "Federal business! Stay back!" "Federal business at a private ranch?" Coulter shouted back, still riding hard, closing the distance. "Pointing guns at women and children? Don't think so." He was close enough now to see details. The men wore no badges, no official markers. Their clothes were trail-worn and dusty. Their horses were good stock, too good for drifters, probably stolen. And their eyes, even from this distance, Coulter could see the calculation in their eyes, weighing whether this fight was worth continuing. Coulter reined his horse to a stop 30 yards from them, his rifle still raised, pointed at the leader's chest. At this range, he wouldn't miss. "You've got 3 seconds to ride out. Otherwise, we're going to have a conversation about how federal agents usually don't shoot at unarmed civilians." "The woman shot first. The woman defended her home. Big difference." Coulter's voice was cold, flat, the voice of a man who'd seen violence before and wasn't afraid of seeing it again. 1, 2. He never got to 3. The leader cursed viciously, wheeled his horse around, and spurred toward the canyon trail. His companions followed, still shooting back wildly, their bullets going wide and high, more noise than threat. Coulter waited until they disappeared into the canyon shadows before he finally lowered his rifle and dismounted. His hands, he noticed distantly, were shaking. Not from fear. He'd gone past fear about the time he'd seen that pistol aimed at Willa. From adrenaline, from fury, from the realization of how close he'd come to losing something he hadn't realized he couldn't lose. "Miguel!" He ran to the old ranch hand first, dropped to his knees beside him. Blood spread across Miguel's shoulder, dark and wet, but he was breathing, conscious, trying to sit up. "Easy, old friend. Let me see." Coulter examined the wound quickly. Through and through, missed anything vital, but Miguel had lost blood and would need proper doctoring. "Willa, get bandages and whiskey." But Willa was already there, her children behind her, Lark holding the medical supplies they kept in the kitchen. Her face was pale but composed, her hands steady now that the immediate danger had passed. She knelt beside Miguel and started cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency, her movements sure despite the blood. "You've done this before," Coulter observed. "Too many times." She didn't look up from her work. "Silas, get me clean cloth. Lark, boil water. Boone, stay back and don't look." But Boone was already looking, his small face white with shock, but his eyes dry. He'd seen violence before too, Coulter realized. They all had. This family had been through more than any family should have to endure. Miguel groaned as Willa packed the wound. "Sorry, boss, they came out of nowhere. Said they were looking for someone. Started asking questions about the woman and kids. I told them to leave, and they shot me." "Looking for someone?" Coulter's blood ran cold. "What did they ask?" "Asked if we had a woman here, dark hair, 3 kids. Said she was wanted for arson and theft in Santa Fe. Said they were bounty hunters hired to bring her back." Willa's hands stilled in their work. Coulter looked at her and saw all the color drain from her face. Saw her mouth open in shock and denial. Saw 3 years of running and hiding and fear come crashing back in a single moment. "That's not true," she whispered. The fire was an accident. I didn't steal anything. I know." Coulter said it firmly, leaving no room for doubt. "I know, Willa. But someone's convinced themselves otherwise, or someone's been paid to believe otherwise. The man from Santa Fe, he must have..." She broke off, horror dawning in her eyes. "He's coming for us. He found us." "Then we'll deal with him when he gets here." "You don't understand. He won't stop. He'll kill you, kill Miguel, burn the whole ranch down if that's what it takes. He's done it before." "I can't..." She stood abruptly, swaying slightly. "I have to leave. I have to take the children and go before he..." "You're not going anywhere." Coulter stood too, catching her shoulders before she could bolt. "You're safe here. I promised you that." "You can't promise that. You don't know what he's capable of." "Then tell me. Tell me everything, right now, so I know what we're dealing with." Willa looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. And in that moment, Coulter saw the full weight of what she'd been carrying. Not just the fear of being found, but the knowledge of what would happen when she was. The certainty that anyone who tried to help her would be hurt, that violence followed her like a shadow, that caring about her was dangerous. "His name is Evan Cross," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He owned the saloon in Santa Fe. And he didn't just hit me, he killed a man who tried to help me leave, shot him in the street, and claimed self-defense. No one questioned it because Evan had money, had influence. And when I finally got away, when the fire happened and gave me the chance to run, he swore he'd find me, swore he'd make me pay. And now he has." Coulter processed this information, his mind already working through options, strategies, defenses. 3 men had come today, and he'd driven them off. But they'd be back, probably with reinforcements. And if this Evan Cross was as dangerous as Willis said, as determined, they'd need to be ready. "All right," he said calmly. "Here's what we're going to do. Miguel needs a doctor. Silas, ride into Socorro and fetch Doc Morrison. Tell him it's urgent. Tom and Davies are probably hiding in the line shack. Someone needs to bring them back, make sure they're all right. And we need to send word to the sheriff, let him know we've got bounty hunters making false claims and shooting ranch hands." "The sheriff won't help," Willa said bitterly. "I'm just a woman with a bad reputation. Evan's word against mine." "Maybe. But he's also a man who shot my ranch hand on my property. That's attempted murder, last I checked. And those men who came here, they threatened my household, fired weapons at civilians. That's assault at minimum." He looked at her directly. "You're not alone in this anymore, Willa. You've got me. Got this ranch. Got the law on your side, whether that's worth anything or not." "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Why would you risk everything for us? We're nothing to you, just hired help." Coulter knew he should agree, should maintain the fiction that this was purely a business arrangement, that his protection extended only as far as his legal obligation as her employer. But standing here in his yard with Miguel bleeding and Willa terrified and 3 children watching with wide, frightened eyes, he couldn't lie. Couldn't pretend he didn't feel what he felt. Couldn't deny what had become increasingly obvious over the past weeks. "You're not nothing," he said simply. "You're—" He stopped. Not sure how to finish that sentence. Not sure what they were to him exactly, except that they mattered. They mattered more than his comfortable isolation, more than his carefully maintained grief, more than his determination never to care about anything again. They mattered enough that he'd ride toward gunfire without hesitation, enough that he'd stand between them and danger without thinking twice, enough that the thought of losing them made his chest tight and his hands shake and his mind go to dark, violent places he'd thought he'd left behind years ago. "Your family," he finished finally, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Maybe not by blood, but family all the same. And I protect what's mine." Willa stared at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her face now, all her careful control finally breaking. Then she stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Coulter wrapped his arms around her carefully, feeling how fragile she was beneath the strength, how much she'd been holding together through sheer force of will. "I'm scared," she whispered against his shirt. "I'm so scared." "I know, but we're going to get through this, together." He looked over her head at her children, at Lark's fierce protectiveness, at Silas's determined jaw, at Boone's tear-stained face. All of us. Together. And standing there in the dust of his ranch yard, with blood on the ground and danger coming, and Willa Hartley crying against his chest, Coulter Vane realized that somewhere along the way he'd stopped just surviving and started living again, started caring again, started believing that maybe, just maybe, the future held something worth fighting for. Even if that fight was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. Silas rode hard for Socorro, his horse's hooves thundering against the packed earth, dust rising in plumes behind him. The boy had insisted on going himself, had looked at Coulter with eyes that belonged on someone much older and said, "I can do it. I'm fast and Doc Morrison knows me from church." There had been no arguing with that determination, that need to be useful in a crisis, to protect his family the only way he could. So Coulter had let him go, watching the boy disappear down the canyon trail with his heart in his throat, hoping he'd made the right choice, hoping Evan Cross's men wouldn't intercept him, hoping the doctor would come quickly and ask no questions that would put Willa in more danger than she was already in. Miguel was settled in the bunkhouse now, Willa tending his wound with capable hands while Lark boiled water and prepared bandages. The old ranch hand had lost blood but was stable, conscious enough to curse fluently in Spanish about getting shot on his own land by cowards who couldn't aim straight. Tom and Davies had emerged from hiding in the line shack, shamefaced but unharmed, and were now stationed as lookouts on the ridge overlooking the canyon trail. Coulter stood on the porch, his rifle within easy reach, watching the horizon and thinking through scenarios. 3 men had come today, testing defenses, seeing what they were up against. They'd report back to whoever hired them, probably this Evan Cross, and next time they'd come prepared. More men, more guns, a plan instead of just a probing attack. The smart thing would be to send Willa and her children away, get them somewhere safe while he dealt with whatever was coming. But where was safe? Evan Cross had found them here, in the middle of nowhere, months after they'd fled Santa Fe. He had resources, determination, and apparently no qualms about violence. Sending them away would just mean they'd be vulnerable on the road, easier targets, with no one to protect them. No, they needed to stay here, needed to make this ranch into a fortress, at least until the threat passed. And if Coulter had to face down Evan Cross himself to make that happen, so be it. He'd faced worse in his 42 years, had stared down rustlers and outlaws, had survived droughts and blizzards, had buried his wife and kept breathing. He could handle one angry man with delusions of ownership. The sound of hoofbeats brought his attention back to the trail. Silas was returning, riding alongside a wagon driven by Doc Morrison, a grizzled old man who'd been practicing medicine in New Mexico territory for longer than Coulter had been alive. The doc pulled his wagon to a stop in the yard and climbed down with the creaking slowness of arthritis and age. "Heard you had some trouble," he said without preamble, grabbing his medical bag. "Boy says Miguel took a bullet. Through and through, shoulder. He's stable but needs proper patching." Doc Morrison grunted. "Anyone else hurt?" "No, sir." "Good. Where is he?" Coulter led the way to the bunkhouse, where Willa was still keeping watch over Miguel. She looked up when they entered, relief flickering across her face when she saw the doctor, quickly replaced by wariness when Doc Morrison's sharp eyes found her. "Mrs. Hartley, this is Doc Morrison. He's here to see to Miguel." The doctor nodded curtly at Willa, then bent over his patient with practiced efficiency. His hands moved quickly, examining the wound, checking for infection, assessing damage. After a few minutes, he straightened with a satisfied grunt. "Good work with the cleaning and packing. You've done this before." "Yes, sir," Willa said quietly. "Thought so. You've got the hands for it." He pulled supplies from his bag, preparing to properly stitch and dress the wound. "You can stay if you want. Help hold him steady. This is going to hurt." Miguel gritted his teeth. "Just do it, Doc. I've had worse." The next 20 minutes were tense, Miguel biting down on a leather strap while Doc Morrison worked, his needle quick and sure despite his age. Willa held Miguel's good shoulder, murmuring words of comfort in Spanish that Coulter hadn't known she spoke. When it was done, the old ranch hand was pale and sweating but alive, the wound properly cleaned and closed. "Keep it clean, change the bandages twice daily, watch for infection," Doc Morrison instructed, packing away his supplies. "If he gets a fever, send for me immediately. Otherwise, he should heal fine. Lucky the bullet missed everything important." "Thank you, Doc," Coulter said. "What do I owe you?" $2 should cover it." The doctor accepted payment, then fixed Coulter with a penetrating stare. "You planning to tell me what really happened here? Because that boy of yours," he gestured toward where Silas stood in the doorway, "was pretty close-mouthed about details. Just said there was shooting and Miguel got hurt." Coulter considered his options. Doc Morrison was known for discretion, but he was also a pillar of the Socorro community. If word got out about bounty hunters and accusations from Santa Fe, it could make everything worse. But the doctor had also been Sarah's physician during her final illness, had sat with Coulter through those last terrible nights, and had never once judged or questioned or offered empty platitudes. If anyone could be trusted with the truth, it was him. "Some men came looking for Mrs. Hartley," Coulter said carefully. "Claiming to be bounty hunters, saying she was wanted for crimes in Santa Fe. Miguel asked them to leave. They shot him instead." Doc Morrison's eyes flicked to Willa, who'd gone very still. "That true? You wanted in Santa Fe?" "There was a fire," Willa said, her voice steady despite the fear Coulter could see in her eyes. "A man I knew died in it. Some people blamed me, but I didn't set it, and I didn't steal anything. I just ran because no one would believe me." The doctor studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he turned back to Coulter. "You believe her?" "I do." "Good enough for me." Doc Morrison picked up his bag. "But you should know, word's already spreading in town.
Those men stopped at the saloon before riding out here, asking questions, showing a sketch. Folks are talking. Coulter felt his jaw tighten. What kind of talking? The usual kind. Some saying Mrs. Hartley must be trouble if men are hunting her. Some saying you're a fool for harboring a criminal. Some, he paused, saying you've been bewitched, that she's using feminine wiles to cloud your judgment. That's ridiculous, Coulter said flatly. Of course it is.
But people love a scandal, especially in a town this small. My advice? Get ahead of it. Talk to Sheriff Brennan, make a formal complaint about the shooting, get your version on record before Evan Cross or his men can spin their own story. Doc Morrison moved toward the door, then paused. And Coulter? Be careful. Men who send bounty hunters to terrorize women and children aren't men who fight fair. Whatever's coming, it won't be clean. After the doctor left, Coulter stood in the bunkhouse trying to process everything. The situation was worse than he'd thought. Not just Evan Cross coming for Willa, but the whole town turning against her, judging her without knowing the facts, ready to believe the worst because believing the worst was easier than thinking for themselves. I should go, Willa said quietly. She was still sitting beside Miguel, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. Before this gets worse, before someone else gets hurt. No. Coulter's voice was firm. Doc Morrison's right. We need to get ahead of this. I'm riding into Socorro to talk to the sheriff, file a formal complaint. While I'm gone, you and the children stay in the house. Tom and Davies will keep watch. Miguel? He looked at the old ranch hand. You rest and heal. We're going to need you. Boss, I can still shoot with my left hand if it comes to that. It won't come to that. Coulter hoped he was telling the truth. But I appreciate it. He left the bunkhouse and found Silas waiting outside, his young face set in determined lines. I'm coming with you. No, you're staying here with your mother and sisters. I can help. Silas. Coulter put a hand on the boy's shoulder. I know you want to help, and you did help, writing for the doctor when it mattered. But the best thing you can do now is stay here and protect your family. Can you do that? The boy's jaw worked as he fought between his desire to be part of the action and his understanding that what Coulter was really asking was for him to be the man of the house while Coulter was gone. Finally, he nodded. Yes, sir. I'll keep them safe. I know you will. Coulter saddled a fresh horse and rode for Socorro as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The 15-mile journey gave him too much time to think, to worry, to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. But by the time he reached town, he'd settled into the cold, focused calm that had gotten him through Sarah's illness and his father's death, and every other crisis that had tried to break him. Socorro was bustling with evening activity when he arrived. Miners coming in from the hills, ranchers restocking supplies, the usual collection of drifters and gamblers and people just passing through. Coulter tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and pushed through the door without knocking. Sheriff Tom Brennan looked up from his desk, surprise crossing his broad face. Coulter Vane, don't usually see you in town after sundown. Something wrong? Got a complaint to file. 3 armed men came to my ranch today, claimed to be bounty hunters, shot my foreman when he asked them to leave. Want to make it official. Brennan sat up straighter, his casual demeanor shifting to professional interest. Miguel all right? He will be. Doc Morrison patched him up, but the men who shot him are still out there, probably planning to come back. You know who they were? Get names? No names. But they were asking about my cook, Mrs. Hartley, claiming she's wanted for arson and theft in Santa Fe. Coulter kept his voice level, factual. I'm telling you now, those claims are false. And even if they weren't, shooting an unarmed man on private property is still attempted murder. Brennan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Heard some talk this afternoon. 3 men came through, showing a sketch, asking questions. Said they were working for a man named Evan Cross, looking for a woman who burned down his establishment and stole from him. Did they show you any legal paperwork? Warrants, court orders, anything official? No, but they seemed pretty convinced she was guilty. They also seemed pretty convinced shooting my foreman was acceptable behavior. Should tell you something about their credibility. Coulter placed both hands flat on the sheriff's desk, leaning forward. Tom, I've known you 15 years, known your family, attended your daughter's wedding. So I'm asking you straight, Are you going to believe some drifters with guns and a story, or are you going to uphold the law? Brennan met his gaze steadily. I'm going to do my job, Coulter, which means investigating. Can't just take your word that Mrs.
Hartley's innocent any more than I can take their word that she's guilty. Need to get the facts. Facts are simple. She's been working for me 2 months, been nothing but honest and hardworking. Meanwhile, 3 strangers show up, shoot a man, and ride off. Which one of those situations sounds like criminal behavior to you? Point taken. The sheriff pulled out a ledger, dipped his pen in ink. Tell me exactly what happened, start to finish. Coulter gave him the whole story. The gunfire, finding Willa defending the house, driving off the attackers, Miguel's injury. He left out the parts about Willa's past, about Santa Fe, about her fear. Those were her stories to tell, not his. He focused on the facts of today's attack, on the clear violation of law that had occurred on his property. When he finished, Brennan set down his pen and rubbed his face. All right, I'll make inquiries, try to track down these bounty hunters, see if they've got any legal standing. But Coulter, he looked up seriously. You should know there's already talk. People saying you're being fooled, that Mrs. Hartley's got you wrapped around her finger, some even suggesting she's replacing your late wife's memory, that you're not thinking straight. Rage flared hot in Coulter's chest, but he kept his voice cold. My private life is none of their damn business. Maybe not. But when it involves shooting and bounty hunters and accusations of arson, it becomes everybody's business. You need to be careful. If this Evan Cross is as connected as he seems to be, if he's got resources to hire men and spread stories, this could get ugly. It's already ugly. Man sends armed thugs after a woman and her children. That's about as ugly as it gets. Coulter straightened. I'm going to say this once, Tom. Willa Hartley and her children are under my protection. Anyone who tries to hurt them will have to go through me. And I'm not going to be as restrained as I was today. Brennan's eyes narrowed. That sounds like you're planning to take the law into your own hands.
That sounds like I'm planning to defend my property and my household from armed attackers. Big difference. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment. Years of friendship and mutual respect balanced against their different understandings of what justice required. Finally, Brennan nodded slowly. Just don't do anything that'll force me to arrest you. I'd hate to have to lock up a friend. Then make sure those bounty hunters know that shooting people in New Mexico territory has consequences, friend or not. Coulter left the sheriff's office and stood on the wooden sidewalk, watching Socorro go about its evening business. He could feel eyes on him, curious and speculative.
Word had spread fast. Within hours, everyone in town knew about the shooting at the Vane Ranch, about the accusations against his cook, about the scandal brewing just beneath the surface of their quiet territorial town. He should go home. Should get back to the ranch before full dark, make sure Willa and the children were safe. But there was one more stop he needed to make. One more person he needed to talk to before the situation spiraled completely out of control. The Socorro Territorial Church sat at the north end of town, a simple adobe structure with a wooden cross above the door. Coulter hadn't been inside since Sarah's funeral, hadn't wanted to face the sympathetic looks and empty platitudes and the weight of all those prayers that had done nothing to save her. But Pastor Williams was also the closest thing Socorro had to a moral authority, and if Coulter wanted the town to give Willa a fair hearing, he needed the pastor on his side. He found the old man in his small office behind the sanctuary, reading by lamplight. Pastor Williams looked up when Coulter knocked, surprise and pleasure crossing his lined face. Coulter Vane, it's been too long. Come in. Sit down. Thank you, Pastor. Coulter sat in the offered chair, suddenly unsure how to begin. I need advice, and maybe help. Of course. What troubles you? So Coulter told him, not everything, but enough. About Willa and her children arriving months ago, about how they'd brought life back to his house, about how today 3 men had come with guns and accusations, about how the town was already judging her without knowing the truth. Pastor Williams listened without interrupting, his weathered hands folded on his desk, his expression thoughtful. When Coulter finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, What do you believe, Coulter, about Mrs. Hartley's innocence? I believe she's a good woman who's had bad things happen to her. I believe she's worked harder than anyone I've ever known to keep her children safe. And I believe those men who came today weren't interested in justice. They were interested in dragging her back to a man who hurt her. And you care about her. About all of them. It wasn't a question. Coulter met the pastor's knowing gaze and decided there was no point in lying. Yes, I care. Maybe more than I should, maybe more than is wise. But I won't apologize for it. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to be honest about what you're willing to risk for them. Pastor Williams leaned forward. Coulter, you're a respected man in this community. You've built a good life, a good name. If you stand by this woman against the accusations, against public opinion, against men who might be willing to kill to get what they want, you could lose everything. I already lost everything when Sarah died. The ranch is just a ranch. My reputation is just words. But Willa and her children, they're real. They're here. They need protection, and I'm the only one standing between them and men who'd do them harm. So yes, I'm willing to risk whatever needs risking. The pastor smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of understanding hard-won truths. Then you have your answer, and you have my support. I'll speak to the congregation on Sunday. Remind them that judgment belongs to God, not to gossips and rumor mongers. I'll make it clear that Mrs. Hartley is a member of our community and deserves the benefit of doubt until proven otherwise. Thank you, Pastor. That means more than you know. Just promise me one thing, Coulter. Promise me you'll be careful, that you won't let anger or fear push you into doing something you can't take back. I promise to do what's necessary to protect my household. That's all I can promise. Pastor Williams nodded slowly. Then may God watch over you all. And Coulter, it's good to see you caring about something again. Sarah would be glad. The words hit harder than expected, bringing a sudden tightness to Coulter's throat. He managed to nod and left quickly, before emotion could overwhelm the careful control he'd been maintaining all day. The ride back to the ranch was dark and tense, every shadow potentially hiding threat, every sound potentially signaling danger. But Coulter made it home without incident, finding the house lit up and welcoming, Tom standing guard on the porch with a rifle across his lap. All quiet, boss, the young ranch hand reported. Nobody's come near since you left. Good. Stay alert. They might try something at night. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and cornbread. Willa was in the kitchen, moving between stove and table with practiced efficiency, despite the stress lines around her eyes. The children were at the table, Lark mending clothes by lamplight, Silas cleaning a rifle that was too big for him, Boone drawing pictures on a slate, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. They all looked up when Coulter entered, hope and fear mingled in their faces. "How's Miguel?" Coulter asked first. "Sleeping. No fever yet. I'll check on him again in a few hours." Willa's hands twisted in her apron. "What did the sheriff say?" "He's making inquiries. I filed a formal complaint about the shooting. He'll look into whether those men have any legal standing." Coulter hung his hat on the peg by the door. "Also talk to Pastor Williams. He's going to speak to the congregation, try to head off the gossip." "And will it help?" Willa's voice was small, doubtful. "I don't know, but it's better than doing nothing." He looked at her directly. "Willa, I need you to tell me everything about Evan Cross. Not just what happened, but who he is, what resources he has, what we're really up against. Can't fight an enemy I don't understand." She glanced at her children, clearly not wanting to discuss this in front of them. Coulter understood. "Lark, take your brothers to your room. Let your mother and me talk." The children obeyed without argument, Lark shepherding her brothers away with quiet efficiency. When the door closed behind them, Willa sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. "I don't know where to start." "Start at the beginning, when you met him." So she did. The story came out slowly, painfully, each word dragged from memory like pulling arrows from flesh. She told him about the year after her husband died, about the struggle to find work that paid enough to feed 3 children, about the mounting debt and the landlord who threatened to throw them onto the street, about meeting Evan Cross in Santa Fe, how he'd seemed kind at first, generous, offering help without strings attached. "He owned the biggest saloon in town," Willa said quietly, "the Silver Dollar. Had girls working upstairs, gambling tables downstairs, his hand in half the businesses in Santa Fe. Everyone knew him, everyone owed him something, and he wanted me." She laughed bitterly. "Not as a wife. He had no interest in that. But as property. Something beautiful he could own and control. How long were you with him? 8 months? 8 months of him getting more possessive, more violent, more convinced that I belonged to him. I tried to leave 3 times. First time, he found me at the edge of town and dragged me back. Second time, he paid the stagecoach driver to refuse me passage. Third time, her voice broke. Third time, a man tried to help me. A merchant who'd been kind to my children. Evan shot him in the street, claimed the man had tried to rob him. No one questioned it. No one dared. And the fire? I was working in the saloon. He made me serve drinks, made me smile at his customers. That night, he came up drunk and angry, started accusing me of flirting with a gambler. I tried to get away. He grabbed me, knocked over a lamp. The whole place went up so fast, dry wood, cheap whiskey, everything just... She gestured helplessly. I got my children out, got some other people out, but 3 died, including Evan's business partner. And Evan told everyone I'd said it deliberately, that I was trying to kill him, that I'd robbed him before I ran. Did you take anything? Just the wages he owed me. $40 I'd earned serving his customers and cleaning his rooms and letting him treat me like property. But he called it theft, put a price on my head, sent men after me. She looked up at Coulter with haunted eyes. And now he knows where I am, and he'll come. Not just the bounty hunters, him, personally. Because it's not about justice or money anymore. It's about the fact that I escaped, that I'm not his, that I chose freedom over him. He can't allow that. Can't allow anyone to think Evan Cross doesn't get what he wants. Coulter absorbed this information, feeling cold rage settle in his gut. He dealt with men like Evan Cross before, bullies who used money and violence to get their way, who saw other people as objects to be owned and controlled, men who couldn't stand being defied, who would rather destroy something than let it go free. When will he come? Soon. Days, maybe. He'll want to make an example of me, show everyone what happens when you run from Evan Cross. She stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen. Coulter, you need to understand, I'm not worth dying for. I'm just a woman with a bad past and 3 children and nothing to offer except trouble. If I leave tonight, if I take the children and disappear again, he'll find you. Just like he found you here. Coulter stood too, catching her shoulders, making her look at him. And next time, you might not be somewhere safe, might not have anyone to stand between you and him, might end up dead in a ditch somewhere with your children left orphans. That what you want? Of course not. But I don't want you dead either. Then stop trying to run and start trusting that maybe, just maybe, you finally found somewhere you can make a stand. He squeezed her shoulders gently. Willa, I'm not some naive fool who doesn't understand the danger. I've seen violence, seen what men like Evan Cross are capable of, but I'm also not going to roll over and let him take what's mine. I'm not yours. The hell you're not. The words came out more intense than he'd intended, raw with emotion he'd been trying to contain. You and your children have been part of this ranch, part of my life, for months now. You've made this house a home again, made me remember what it's like to care about something beyond just surviving another day. You think I'm just going to hand that over to some violent bastard who thinks he owns you? Not happening. Willa stared at him, her gray eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. You don't know what you're saying. You're lonely, and we've been convenient, and don't tell me what I'm feeling. Coulter's voice was rough but not harsh. I know exactly what this is. I know I care about you more than is probably wise. I know I'd face down the devil himself to keep you and your children safe. And I know that even if Evan Cross brings an army, even if this ends badly, I'd rather stand and fight than spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have saved you and just didn't try. The tears spilled over now, tracking down Willa's cheeks. Why? Why do you care so much? Because somewhere along the way you stopped being my employee and started being everything. Because your laughter fills this house with joy. Because your strength humbles me. Because I look at you and see a future I thought died with Sarah. Because I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me and thrills me in equal measure, and I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore. But Coulter couldn't say any of that. Not now, not with danger coming and emotions running high and everything so uncertain. So instead, he just pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, and let her cry against his chest while the house settled into uneasy quiet around them. We'll figure this out, he murmured into her hair. Together. I promise.
And in that moment, holding Willa Hartley while she trembled with fear and relief and something that might have been hope, Coulter Vane made a decision. Whatever came next, whatever price he had to pay, he would keep this family safe, would stand between them and Evan Cross and anyone else who tried to hurt them. Because they were his now, in all the ways that mattered. And Coulter Vane protected what was his. The night passed without incident, but no one slept much. Coulter dozed in his office chair, one ear always listening for sounds of approach. Tom and Davies split the watch, circling the house and barn every hour. Inside, Willa checked on Miguel regularly, keeping his fever at bay with cold compresses and willpower. The children huddled in their room, pretending to sleep but really just waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. Morning came with deceptive beauty, clear sky, cool air, the promise of another perfect August day. But beauty meant nothing when danger was coming. Beauty just made it easier to see your enemies approaching across the empty desert. Coulter was drinking coffee on the porch when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Not 3 riders this time. 6, maybe 7. Moving with purpose, not bothering to hide their approach. Coming in daylight because they didn't need to hide anymore. "Tom! Davies! Riders coming!" His voice carried across the yard, sharp and urgent. "Get positions!" The ranch hands scattered, Tom to the barn loft with a rifle, Davies behind the water trough, with a clear line of sight to the main approach. Miguel emerged from the bunkhouse, his wounded shoulder strapped tight, his left hand holding a pistol with grim determination. "You should be resting," Coulter told him. "Rest when I'm dead, boss. Today's not that day." Willa appeared in the doorway, her children behind her, her face pale but composed. "How many?" 7, maybe more. Coulter checked his rifle, made sure his pistol was loaded and ready. "Get back inside. Lock the doors. Don't come out unless I tell you."
I can shoot. Willa, please. He looked at her directly. "I need to know you and the children are safe. Need to focus on what's coming without worrying about you. Can you do that for me?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." "Always am." She retreated into the house and Coulter heard the door bolt slide home. Good. Whatever happened next, at least they'd be protected. At least he wouldn't have to worry about a stray bullet finding them. The riders grew closer, resolving from dust cloud to distinct shapes. 7 men, as he'd thought. 6 of them were rough types, hired guns by the look of them. But the 7th, riding in the center like a general commanding troops, he was different. Well-dressed, confident, riding a horse that had cost more than most men made in a year. Evan Cross. Had to be. The rider stopped 30 yards from the house, spreading out in a loose semicircle, a formation that would let them surround the ranch if shooting started. Coulter stood his ground on the porch, his rifle held ready but not aimed, projecting calm he didn't feel. Evan Cross dismounted and walked forward a few steps, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid being rushed. He was maybe 50, well-fed and prosperous, with cold eyes that assessed Coulter the way a man might assess livestock at auction. "Mr. Vane, I presume?" His voice was cultured, educated, with just a hint of southern breeding. "I'm Evan Cross. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have employees. None of them belong to you." "Ah, so she has bewitched you." Cross smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let me be clear. Willa Hartley is a criminal. She burned down my establishment, killed my business partner, stole from me. I'm here to take her back to Santa Fe to face justice. Funny kind of justice that requires 7 armed men. The kind necessary when dealing with a murderer and a thief. Now, I can do this easy or hard, Mr. Vane. Easy means you turn her over, I pay you for your trouble, and everyone goes home happy. Hard means," he gestured to his men. "Well, I'd rather not resort to hard, but I will if necessary." Coulter let his rifle come up slowly, not pointing at Cross but making his position clear. "Here's the thing, Cross. I don't believe your story. I think you're a violent man who hurt a woman, and when she escaped, you invented crimes to justify hunting her down. I think those men you sent yesterday shot my foreman without provocation. And I think if you want to take Mrs. Hartley anywhere, you're going to have to go through me first. Don't be foolish. You're outnumbered 7 to, 3? 4? Those aren't good odds." "Maybe not,
But the first man who pulls a gun dies. And I'm betting that'll be you." Coulter's voice was cold, flat, the voice of a man who'd already decided he was willing to die if that's what it took. "So ask yourself, is your pride worth your life? Because that's what you're risking here." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Cross's face. He'd expected Coulter to cave, to be reasonable, to hand over Willa rather than risk violence. He hadn't expected someone willing to make this a gunfight he might not survive. "You're making a mistake," Cross said. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. This is my land, my ranch, my household. And you're trespassing. So I'll give you one chance. Turn around, ride back to Santa Fe. Forget about Willa Hartley. Otherwise what?" Cross's voice hardened. "You'll shoot? You'll kill? You're not that man, Vane. I checked. You're a widower who hides from the world. You don't have the stomach for real violence. Try me and find out." The standoff held, stretched thin and tense, everyone waiting for someone to make the first move. Coulter could feel sweat trickling down his back despite the morning cool, could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears, could see Cross's hired guns fingering their weapons, waiting for the order. This was it. The moment when talk ended and bullets started flying. The moment when everything changed. And then Sheriff Brennan's voice cut across the yard like a gunshot. "Nobody moves. This is official law business." And Comye-sang document, Part 5. The sheriff rode in from the canyon trail with 3 deputies, their badges catching the morning sun, their rifles held ready across their saddles. Brennan's weathered face was grim as he positioned his men between Coulter's porch and Evan Cross's hired guns, creating a buffer that turned the standoff into something more complicated than just 2 sides facing off. "Mr. Cross," Brennan said, his voice carrying the weight of territorial law, "I'm going to need you and your men to lower your weapons and step back." Cross's smile was thin and cold. "Sheriff, good to see law enforcement finally arriving. I'm here to collect a fugitive, Willa Hartley. She's wanted for arson and theft in Santa Fe. I have the right to—" "You have the right to nothing without proper documentation." Brennan cut him off smoothly. "Which you don't have. I sent a wire to Santa Fe last night, talked to their territorial marshal. Know what he told me? There's no warrant for Mrs. Hartley, no charges filed, no legal standing whatsoever." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward through the assembled men. Coulter felt something loosen in his chest. Hope, maybe, or just the first breath after holding tension so long his ribs ached. Cross's face darkened. "That's impossible. I filed charges myself." "You filed a complaint. Big difference. Complaint got reviewed by the territorial prosecutor, who declined to pursue it due to lack of evidence. No witnesses placing Mrs. Hartley at the scene of the fire's origin. No proof of theft. Just your word against hers, and your word," Brennan paused deliberately, "carries less weight than you might think, given your reputation." "My reputation is impeccable. Your reputation is that of a man who runs a saloon with gambling and prostitution, who's been investigated twice for corruption, and who was questioned in connection with the death of a merchant named Thomas Webb. Sound familiar?" Cross's jaw tightened dangerously. "Webb tried to rob me. That was self-defense. According to you, according to several witnesses I found when I dug deeper, Webb tried to help Mrs. Hartley leave town, and you shot him in the back. But the investigation got buried because you own half the officials in Santa Fe. Fortunate for you that murder's hard to prove without witnesses willing to testify." Brennan's voice was steel-wrapped in velvet. "Less fortunate that you thought you could bring your territorial corruption into my jurisdiction. I have every right to recover my property. Mrs. Hartley is not property. She's a free woman living and working legally in New Mexico territory. And you," Brennan gestured to the hired guns, "brought 7 armed men onto private land, threatened a rancher, and yesterday your men shot a ranch hand without provocation. That's assault with a deadly weapon. Trespassing. Attempted murder. I've got grounds to arrest every one of you right now." One of Cross's hired guns shifted nervously. Another's hand drifted away from his pistol. The confidence that had carried them here was evaporating under the weight of actual law, actual consequences. They were hired muscle, not outlaws willing to face hanging for someone else's obsession. Cross saw his advantage slipping and played his last card. "Sheriff, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. I have connections. Friends in high places. One word from me and your career set is protected by territorial law and the fact that I'm doing my job. Brennan's voice never wavered. And you know what I've got that you don't? A telegraph line. Already sent word to the territorial marshal about this situation. He's very interested in a wealthy saloon owner using hired guns to pursue personal vendettas across territorial lines. Suggested I might want to hold you for questioning until he can ride down from Santa Fe himself. The threat landed perfectly. Cross went very still, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. He'd come here expecting to steamroll over an isolated rancher and a frightened woman. Instead, he'd walked into legal complications that could tie him up for months, could expose business dealings he'd rather keep hidden, could cost him more than retrieving Willow was worth. But men like Evan Cross didn't surrender easily. They especially didn't surrender when they felt humiliated, when they'd been challenged in front of witnesses, when their control was slipping. Coulter saw it in the way Cross's hand moved toward his coat, saw the calculation in those cold eyes, saw the moment when pride overwhelmed self-preservation. "She's mine," Cross said quietly, dangerously. "And I don't leave empty-handed." His hand went for the pistol hidden in his coat. Coulter's rifle came up on pure instinct, but he was too far away, the angle wrong, and Cross was fast, practiced, his gun clearing leather with the smooth motion of someone who'd done this before. The shot that rang out didn't come from Coulter's rifle. It came from the house. From the second-floor window Coulter had forgotten even existed because he never went up there anymore. The bullet took Cross in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, his pistol falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Willa stood in that window, Coulter's other rifle, the one he'd stored in the upstairs bedroom he couldn't bear to enter, smoking in her hands. Her face was pale but set, her gray eyes fierce with the determination of someone who'd finally stopped running and decided to fight. "I said no," she called down, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. "I said no to you 3 years ago in Santa Fe, and I'm saying no now. I'm not yours. I was never yours. And if you come after me or my children again, the next bullet won't be in your shoulder." The hired guns scattered like startled birds, hands up, moving away from Cross, making it clear they wanted no part of this anymore. Sheriff Brennan was already moving, his deputies with him, surrounding Cross before the wounded man could recover his pistol. "Evan Cross, you're under arrest for attempted assault, trespassing, and about 6 other charges I'll think of on the ride back to Socorro." Brennan gestured to his deputies. "Get him bandaged and on a horse. The rest of you," he addressed the hired guns, "you've got 1 hour to be out of this territory. After that, I see any of you. I'm assuming you're part of Cross's criminal enterprise and arresting you accordingly." They didn't need to be told twice. Within minutes, 6 horses were galloping back down the canyon trail, kicking up dust in their desperation to be gone. Cross, his shoulder wrapped in rough bandages, sat on his horse with his hands bound, his face twisted in rage and pain and disbelief that this had happened, that he'd lost, that a woman he'd thought he owned had shot him. Brennan mounted up, then paused and looked at Coulter. "That was close. Too close. You should have sent for me earlier. Didn't know if you'd come." "I'm the law. Of course I'd come." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "You did good, Coulter. Standing up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. Your father would have been proud." Then they were gone. Evan Cross and his failed vengeance disappearing down the trail toward Socorro and jail, and the legal consequences he'd thought his money could protect him from. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Coulter's boots on the stairs as he took them 3 at a time, heading for the second floor, for the room he hadn't entered in 3 years, for Willa. She was still standing at the window, the rifle hanging loose in her hands now, her whole body shaking with reaction. Coulter crossed the room and carefully took the rifle from her, setting it aside before pulling her into his arms. "You shot him," he said, half laughing, half shocked. "You actually shot him. I couldn't let him hurt you, couldn't let him take me, couldn't—" Her voice broke. "I'm so tired of running, Coulter, so tired of being afraid. And when I saw him reaching for his gun, saw you in the line of fire, I couldn't lose this. Couldn't lose you." Coulter held her tighter, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, soap and sunshine and courage that had carried her through hell and out the other side. "You didn't lose anything. You won. We won. Is it really over? She pulled back enough to look at his face, her eyes searching for truth. Can it really be over? Sheriff has him in custody. No legal standing for his accusations. Witnesses to attempted assault. He's going to jail, Willa, and even if he gets out eventually, he knows now that you're not alone, not defenseless. He knows coming after you means facing consequences. Coulter cupped her face in his hands. You're free. Finally, actually free. The tears came then, great shaking sobs that were equal parts relief and grief and the release of 3 years of fear she'd been carrying like stones in her pockets. Coulter held her through it all, murmuring wordless comfort, stroking her hair, letting her cry out every moment of terror, every sleepless night, every time she'd wondered if today would be the day Evan Cross found them. When the storm finally passed, Willa looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and a tremulous smile. I shot him from Sarah's room, from her window. I hope she doesn't mind. She wouldn't mind. Coulter looked around the room he'd been avoiding, seeing it now with new eyes. Sarah's embroidery still hung on the wall, her hairbrush still sat on the dresser, the curtains she'd sewn still framed the window where Willa had made her stand. She'd probably say it was about time someone used this room for something useful, instead of letting it gather dust as a shrine. You loved her very much. I did. Still do, in the way you love people who shaped your life even after they're gone. He looked down at Willa, at this woman who'd brought his house back to life, who'd reminded him what it felt like to care about something beyond just surviving. But Sarah's gone, and I'm still here, still living, and I'm starting to think maybe that's allowed. Maybe I'm allowed to move forward instead of staying frozen in the past. Willa's hand came up to rest against his chest, right over his heart. What are you saying, Coulter? What was he saying? That somewhere between hiring her as a cook and standing in his yard ready to die to protect her, he'd fallen in love? That watching her defend her children with fierce maternal devotion had shown him what real strength looked like? That coming home to her smile and her cooking and the sound of her children's laughter had healed wounds he'd thought were permanent? All of that, none of that, everything compressed into the simple truth that he couldn't imagine his life without her anymore. I'm saying stay, he said simply. Not as an employee, not hiding in the housekeeper's room like you're just passing through. Stay as whatever you want to be, as my partner, my companion, as, he took a breath, as my wife, if you'd consider it, someday. When you're ready, no pressure, no expectations, just stay, build a life here, with me. Willa's eyes widened, filling with fresh tears. Coulter, I have 3 children. I have a past. I have nothing to bring to a marriage except complications, and you have everything I need. You have strength and courage and the ability to laugh, even when life's kicked you down. You have 3 incredible children who've already made this ranch feel like home, and you have me, if you want me. Broken pieces and all. He smiled slightly. Fair warning, I'm not easy. I'm stubborn, and I'm too used to being alone, and I'll probably mess this up 100 times, but I'll try. For you, I'll try. You won't mess it up. Willa's hand moved from his chest to his face, cupping his jaw with infinite tenderness. You're the best man I've ever known, kind and strong and honorable. You saved us, saved me. How could I not? She stopped, emotion choking off her words. How could you not what? How could I not love you? She whispered. I tried not to. Tried to keep appropriate distance, tried to remember I was just an employee, tried not to hope for anything beyond safety and survival. But you made it impossible. You saw me, really saw me, not as a victim or a scandal or someone to pity, but as a person worth protecting, worth caring about. And I fell in love with you somewhere between that first breakfast and right now, standing in your late wife's room, having just shot a man to keep him from hurting you. Coulter laughed, a sound of pure joy that felt rusty from disuse but real, so real. That's quite a range of time to pinpoint. I'm not good at romantic declarations. I'm better at practical things like cooking and sewing and apparently shooting people who threaten my family. Our family, Coulter corrected gently. If you'll have me. If you'll let me be part of it. Yes. The word was simple,
definitive, carrying the weight of every hope she'd been afraid to voice. Yes to all of it, to staying, to building a life, to someday being your wife. Yes to everything, Coulter Vane. He kissed her then, there in Sarah's room, with the morning sun streaming through the window and the sound of her children calling from downstairs and the smell of dust and gunpowder still lingering in the air. It was a kiss that tasted like promise and possibility, and the beginning of something neither of them had thought they'd find again. When they finally pulled apart, Willa was smiling through her tears. The children will have questions. Then we'll answer them, together. Coulter took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Come on, let's go tell them they're home. They descended the stairs to find all three children waiting anxiously in the kitchen. Lark stood with her arms around her brothers, protective and fierce. Silas held a knife he'd grabbed from the counter, ready to defend despite being 10 years old and no match for grown men. And Boone clutched his mother's apron, which he must have grabbed from the hook, holding it like a talisman. The moment they saw Willa, all three children rushed forward, wrapping themselves around her in a tangle of arms and relief and muffled sobs. She sank to her knees and pulled them close, pressing kisses into their hair, murmuring that it was over. They were safe. Everything was going to be all right now. Over their heads, her eyes found Coulter's. In that look was gratitude and love and the beginning of trust that maybe, finally, they'd found somewhere they could stop running, somewhere they could build a life instead of just surviving. Coulter cleared his throat. Kids, I need to tell you something. Your mama and I, we've decided that this isn't temporary anymore. This is your home, for as long as you want it. And if you're agreeable, he looked at each of them in turn, I'd like to be part of your family, not replacing your father, never that, but maybe as someone who cares about you, someone who'll be here. Silas studied him seriously. You mean you want to marry Mama? Someday. When she's ready, when you're all ready, no rush. Coulter met the boy's gaze steadily. But yes, that's what I mean. Lark's eyes were bright with tears. You'd want us? All of us? Even knowing about Santa Fe and Evan Cross and everything? Especially knowing all that. Because it means I know how strong you all are, how brave. And I'd be honored to have that kind of courage in my family. Boone tugged on Coulter's pant leg, looking up with those two old eyes that were finally starting to look like they belonged on a 6-year-old. Does this mean I don't have to run anymore? We can stay forever? Coulter crouched down to Boone's level. It means you can stay as long as forever lasts. This is your home now, your ranch, your land. Nobody's going to take that from you. Promise? The same question Boone had asked in the barn that evening that felt like a lifetime ago. Promise. Boone threw his arms around Coulter's neck in a fierce hug that nearly knocked him over. Then Silas was there too, awkward and adolescent, but needing the comfort of physical touch. And Lark, trying to hold back tears and failing, joining her brothers in a family embrace that included Coulter for the first time. Willa watched them, her hand over her mouth, joy and disbelief warring on her face. This was everything she'd dreamed of during those long years of running. Safety, stability, someone strong enough to share the burden of protecting her children. And more than that, love. Actual, real love that wasn't about possession or control but about choosing each other, about building something together. The moment was interrupted by Miguel's voice from the doorway. Boss, everything all right? Heard the shot, saw the sheriff leave with that pendejo? We good? Coulter straightened, his arms still around the children. We're good, Miguel. Better than good. It's over. Cross is in custody. No more running. No more threats. Gracias a Dios. Miguel crossed himself, then looked at the assembled family with knowing eyes. About time, boss. House has been too quiet for too long. Needs children. Needs laughter. Needs life. Agreed. Coulter looked at Willa. Think you can make breakfast for everyone? Celebration meal. We've got things to be grateful for. I think I can manage that. Willa stood, brushing tears from her face, already moving toward the stove with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years making do with less. But now her movements were lighter, freer, unburdened by the constant fear that had shadowed her for so long. The day that followed was strange and wonderful in equal measure. Word spread quickly through the ranch that the danger had passed, that Evan Cross was in custody, that the household was safe.
Tom and Davies emerged from their defensive positions, relief evident on their faces. Miguel, despite his wounded shoulder, insisted on joining them for the celebratory breakfast, telling increasingly embellished stories about the morning's confrontation until Boone was wide-eyed with wonder and Lark was laughing at the more obvious exaggerations. After breakfast, Coulter made a decision. He walked upstairs to Sarah's room. No, not Sarah's room anymore, just the master bedroom, and began opening windows, letting in fresh air and sunlight. He carefully packed away Sarah's personal items, her hairbrush, her embroidery, the small jewelry box she'd cherished, wrapping them in cloth and storing them in the attic where they'd be safe but not on constant display. He stripped the bed and carried the linens downstairs for washing. He took down the curtains that had hung untouched for 3 years and folded them carefully. It wasn't forgetting Sarah. It was making room for the future, making room for Willa and the life they were going to build together. Willa found him there as he was finishing, her arms full of fresh linens. "I can do this. You don't have to. I want to." Coulter took the linens from her and began making the bed with her help. "It's time. Past time, really. Sarah wouldn't want me living in a museum. She'd want me living in a home." "Tell me about her," Willa said softly as they worked. "Not just that she was kind or that you loved her. Tell me what she was really like." So Coulter did. He told her about Sarah's terrible singing voice and how she sang anyway, at the top of her lungs, while she gardened. About how she couldn't cook to save her life but kept trying, producing meals that ranged from barely edible to actually dangerous. About her habit of collecting stray animals until the ranch had more barn cats than cattle. About the way she'd laugh at her own jokes before she finished telling them, making everyone else laugh too just from her joy. "She sounds wonderful," Willa said when he finished. "She was. And she'd like you, I think. Would appreciate your strength, your practical nature, your ability to actually cook something that doesn't poison people." He smiled slightly. "She'd probably make some terrible joke about how I finally found someone who could keep me fed properly. I'd like to think she'd approve. Of us. Of this." Willa smoothed the fresh quilt across the bed. "She would." "Sarah believed in living, in loving, and not wasting the time you're given. She'd be glad I'm not wasting mine anymore." They finished preparing the room in companionable silence, transforming it from a shrine to the past into a space ready for the future. When they were done, Coulter looked around at the clean, bright room and felt something inside him finally settle. Grief would always be there. He'd always miss Sarah, always carry the memory of her. But grief didn't have to be his whole life, didn't have to prevent him from moving forward, from loving again, from building something new. The weeks that followed were a study in adjustment. Willa and the children moved from the cramped housekeeper's room into proper bedrooms. Lark got the small room at the front of the house with the window overlooking the garden she'd brought back to life. The boys shared the larger room at the back, with space for their growing collection of carved animals and books and the 1,000 small treasures of childhood. And Willa, after much discussion and careful consideration of propriety, moved into the master bedroom with Coulter. "People will talk," she'd warned him. "Let them talk. We know the truth, that we're building a life together, that we're committed to each other, that we'll make it official as soon as you're ready. What anyone else thinks doesn't matter." So she'd moved her few possessions into the room that was now theirs, hanging her dresses next to his shirts, placing her hairbrush on the dresser beside where Sarah's used to sit, claiming space with a hesitancy that gradually faded into belonging. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Willa's organizational skills and Coulter's ranching knowledge created a partnership that made everything run smoother. She took over the account books, discovering she had a head for numbers that let her track expenses and income with precision. She negotiated better prices with suppliers in Socorro, charming them with her directness and fair dealing. She turned the ranch house into the kind of place people actually wanted to visit, hosting Sunday dinners that drew the neighboring ranchers and their families. And slowly, painfully slowly, the gossip that had threatened to destroy them died down. When people saw how happy the children were, how well the ranch was running, how Coulter smiled again after 3 years of grief, they started to revise their opinions. Pastor Williams's Sunday sermon on the sin of judgment helped. Sheriff Brennan's regular reports on Evan Cross's trial and conviction helped more. But what helped most was time. and the simple evidence that this unconventional family was thriving in ways that conventional families often didn't. Silas grew into his role as Miguel's apprentice, his thin frame filling out with good food and hard work. By fall roundup, he could rope a calf almost as well as the adult hands, his young face serious with concentration, his movements sure. Miguel treated him like a grandson, teaching him not just ranch work, but life lessons about honor and hard work, and treating people with respect regardless of their station. Lark blossomed in the stability of a home that wouldn't be ripped away without warning. She started school in Socorro, riding in 3 days a week with Tom when he went for supplies, and astonished her teacher with her reading level and hunger for learning. She talked about maybe becoming a teacher herself someday, maybe starting a school for ranch children who couldn't get to Socorro regularly. Coulter encouraged her dreams, ordered books from as far away as Kansas City, made it clear that her future was limited only by her own ambition. And Boone finally got to be a child. He played in the dirt and helped with the animals and asked endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how horses knew where to put their feet. The fear that had shadowed him faded gradually, replaced by the confidence of a boy who knew he was loved, who knew he was safe, who knew tomorrow would come, and he'd still be here in this place that was home. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Coulter realized something had shifted in him. The emptiness that had defined his existence for 3 years was gone, filled by laughter and purpose, and the simple pleasure of coming home to people who were glad to see him. He still missed Sarah, would always miss her, but the grief no longer consumed him. It had become something he carried rather than something that carried him, a part of his story, but not the whole story. One evening in late October, with the first snow threatening in the mountains and the smell of Willa's beef stew filling the house, Coulter gathered everyone in the front room. The children sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, Boone drowsy against Lark's shoulder, Silas whittling a piece of wood into some shape only he could envision yet. Willa sat in the chair Sarah used to favor, her hands busy with mending, her face peaceful in the firelight. "I've been thinking," Coulter began, then stopped, not sure how to say what needed saying. He tried again. "We've been living together as a family for months now. The children call this home. Willa runs this household like it's hers because it is hers, and I'm happier than I've been in years, maybe happier than I've ever been." "But," Willa prompted gently, "but I want to make it official. Want to stand up in front of Pastor Williams and the whole town and say that you're my wife, that these children are mine, that we're a family in every way that matters." He looked at each of them in turn. "I know we talked about waiting, about taking our time, but I don't want to wait anymore. I want everyone to know you belong here, belong with me. If," he swallowed hard, "if you'll have me." Willa set down her mending, her gray eyes shining in the firelight. "Are you proposing to me, Coulter Vane?" "I am. Properly this time, not in the middle of a crisis or while I'm covered in dust from the range. I'm asking if you'll marry me, be my wife. Let me be a father to your children. Build this life with me permanently." "What do the children think?" Willa looked at Lark, Silas, Boone. "This affects you as much as it affects me." Lark answered first, her voice thick with emotion. "I think Mr. Vane, Coulter, is the best man I've ever known. I think he's been more of a father to us in 6 months than anyone ever was. And I think you smile more when you're with him, Mama. Real smiles, not the ones you wear when you're pretending everything's fine." Silas nodded seriously. "Miguel says a good man protects his family and keeps his word. Coulter does both. That's good enough for me." Boone just crawled over to Coulter and climbed into his lap, wrapping small arms around his neck. "You're my papa now, right?" Coulter's throat tightened dangerously. "If you want me to be." "I want." Boone settled against his chest with the complete trust of a child who'd finally found safety. "Forever and ever. Forever and ever," Coulter agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Willa stood and crossed to where Coulter sat with Boone in his lap. She cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle, her eyes searching his. "You're sure? No doubts? No reservations? Because once we do this, we're truly a family. My past, my complications, my children, all of it becomes yours." "I know. I'm counting on it." He covered her hands with his. You brought my life back, Willa. Brought my house back. Brought me back. I was just existing before you arrived, going through motions, waiting for nothing. But you and your children, you gave me a reason to actually live again. So yes, I'm sure. More sure than I've been about anything in a very long time. Then yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to building this life together. Yes to everything. He kissed her then, mindful of the children watching but needing to seal the promise with more than just words. It was a gentle kiss, full of love and commitment, and the certainty that this was right. This was what they were both meant to find after all the years of loss and loneliness. When they pulled apart, all three children were grinning. Even Silas, who prided himself on being too grown up for sentiment, couldn't hide his smile. When? Lark asked practically. When will you get married? Coulter looked at Willa. What do you think? Spring? After the snow melts and we can actually get everyone to the church? Spring seems very far away. Willa's eyes danced with mischief. What about Christmas? We could have a small ceremony, just family and close friends. Nothing fancy, just honest promises in front of people who matter. Christmas, Coulter agreed, liking the symbolism of it. New beginnings in the middle of winter, hope blooming even in the coldest season. Christmas it is. The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a flurry of preparation. Willa sewed herself a dress from the blue calico Coulter had bought months ago, working by lamplight after the children were asleep, her needle flying through fabric with practiced ease. Lark made wildflower decorations dried from the summer garden, preserving them carefully for the ceremony. Silas helped Miguel repair the buckboard so it would be presentable for the ride to church. And Boone made drawings of the family, stick figures with huge smiles, holding hands in front of a house that looked nothing like the actual ranch, but everything like home. Word spread through Socorro that Coulter Vane was finally getting married, that the widow Hartley would become Mrs. Vane, that the unconventional family was making itself official. Some people disapproved, muttering about unseemly haste and the impropriety of living together before marriage. But most people, the ones who actually knew Coulter, who'd seen how he'd changed, who understood that love came in its own time and didn't follow society's arbitrary rules, were genuinely happy for them. Doc Morrison offered his medical bag as a wedding gift, saying Willa's natural talent for healing should be properly supported. The grocer's wife gave them a beautiful quilt she'd been working on for years, saying she'd been saving it for someone special. Even Sheriff Brennan stopped by the ranch with a bottle of whiskey and gruff congratulations, mentioning casually that Evan Cross had been sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison and wouldn't be bothering anyone for a very long time. Miguel gave them something more precious than any material gift, his blessing. The old ranch hand had been like a father to Coulter since his own father died, and having Miguel's approval meant everything. Your papa would be proud, Miguel told him on Christmas Eve as they were preparing for the next day's ceremony. You found your way back to living. That's not easy after loss. But you did it. And Sarah, she would be happy for you too. You think so? I know so. She loved you enough to want you happy, even if that happiness came after she was gone. That's real love, boss. The kind that doesn't end just because life does. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. The sky, that particular shade of blue that only happens in winter at high altitude. Snow had fallen during the night, turning the ranch into something from a storybook, white and pristine and beautiful. The family dressed in their finest clothes, the children excited and nervous in equal measure, Willa radiant in her blue dress with Lark's dried flowers woven into her dark hair. They rode to Socorro in the repaired buckboard, wrapped in blankets against the cold, the children chattering about the ceremony and the small celebration that would follow. Coulter drove with Willa beside him, their hands joined under the blanket, neither speaking but both feeling the significance of the day, of the choice they were making to bind their lives together permanently. The Socorro Territorial Church was filled when they arrived, not packed, but fuller than Coulter had expected. Neighboring ranchers and their families, townspeople who'd known him for years, friends who'd stuck by him through Sarah's illness and the dark years that followed. Even Tom and Davies had come, scrubbed clean and looking uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. Pastor Williams stood at the front of the church, his weathered face wreathed in smiles. Dearly beloved,
he began when everyone was settled. "We are gathered here on this blessed Christmas day to witness the union of Coulter Vane and Willa Hartley in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and traditional, the words familiar from countless weddings Coulter had attended over the years. But when he spoke his vows, promising to love and honor Willa, to care for her children as his own, to build a life together in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, the words felt new, felt weighted with genuine meaning instead of just ritual. And when Willa spoke her vows, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, promising to love him faithfully, to stand beside him through whatever life brought, to make their house a home, Coulter felt something break open in his chest, some last locked door swinging wide to let in light and air and possibility. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying through the small church. "Coulter, you may kiss your bride." So he did, there in front of God and the people of Socorro and 3 children who'd become his own. He kissed Willa Vane, no longer Hartley, but Vane, his wife, his partner, his choice, and felt the rightness of it settle into his bones like warmth after a long winter. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful. Someone had organized food and drink in the church hall, and suddenly there was music and laughter and children running between the adults' legs. Coulter danced with his new wife, awkward because he'd never been graceful, but not caring because Willa was laughing and her eyes were bright with happiness, and this moment was perfect just as it was. He danced with Lark too, who blushed and stepped on his feet but glowed with pleasure at being treated like the young lady she was becoming. And he lifted Boone onto his feet, letting the boy stand on his boots while they swayed to the music, Boone giggling at the silliness of it. As the sun began to set and families started heading home before full dark, Coulter stood on the church steps with his arm around Willa's waist, watching the children play in the snow with some of the town kids. They looked so normal, so happy, so completely unlike the frightened, too quiet children who'd arrived at his ranch 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on their backs and their mother's fierce determination to keep them safe. "What are you thinking?" Willa asked softly. "That I'm the luckiest man alive." He pulled her closer. "That I got a second chance I didn't think I deserved. That I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone. That—" He stopped, emotion choking off words. "That you're happy," Willa finished for him. "I can see it in your face. The shadows are gone. You're actually, genuinely happy." "I am. Because of you. Because of them." He gestured to the children. "You saved me, Willa. You and your children walked into my life and saved me from slowly turning into a ghost, haunting my own house. We saved each other, I think. You gave us safety. We gave you purpose. Fair trade." "More than fair." He kissed her temple. "Come on. Let's go home." Home. The word had never sounded better. They collected the children and rode back to the ranch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The house was warm and welcoming when they arrived, candles lit in the windows courtesy of Miguel, who'd stayed behind to tend the animals and prepare a simple supper for the newly expanded family. That night, with the children finally asleep in their rooms and the house quiet around them, Coulter and Willa stood in their bedroom now, truly theirs, and just looked at each other. "So," Willa said, a smile playing at her lips, "what happens now?" "Now we live," Coulter said simply. "We wake up tomorrow and the day after and all the days after that, and we build this life we promised each other. We raise these children. We run this ranch. We figure things out as we go, probably make mistakes, definitely have hard times. But we do it together." "Together," Willa agreed. "I like the sound of that." "Me too." And so they did. The years that followed weren't perfect. Life never is. But they were good. The ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding gradually as Coulter and Willa reinvested profits into better stock and improved land. Silas grew into a fine young man, taking on more responsibility until Miguel could barely tell the difference between working with the boy and working with a full hand. When Miguel finally retired at 70, it was Silas who stepped into his role as foreman, managing the ranch with the same quiet competence he'd learned from both his mentors. Lark finished school in Socorro,
and, true to her childhood dream, started a small school for ranch children who couldn't make the daily journey to town. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic from the Vane Ranch House, which had expanded to include a dedicated schoolroom. She never married, preferring her independence and her students, but she was content in a way that made it clear marriage wasn't necessary for happiness. Boone grew up with no memory of fear, no recollection of the days when home was uncertain and safety was temporary. He became a veterinarian, studying in Santa Fe, ironic, considering his mother's history there, and returning to practice in Socorro. He treated the ranch animals for free because, as he told Coulter, "You gave me a home. Least I can do is keep your horses healthy." And Coulter and Willa? They grew old together the way people do when they've chosen each other deliberately, when they've built something real instead of just settling for what's easy. They had disagreements and difficult seasons, times when the ranch struggled and times when their different approaches to problems caused friction. But they talked through it, worked through it, always coming back to the fundamental truth that they were better together than apart. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Coulter took Willa back to the spot where she'd first arrived at the ranch, where the dusty road opened onto the yard and the house came into view. It looked different now, larger, better maintained, surrounded by gardens and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity. But it was still fundamentally the same place, the same land, the same home. "Remember the first time you saw this place?" Coulter asked. "Of course. I thought it looked lonely, like it needed people to bring it back to life." "You did that, brought it to life, brought me to life." "We did it together," Willa corrected, taking his hand. "You saved us. We saved you. And then we built something neither of us could have built alone." That evening, with all three grown children and their families gathered around the dinner table, because family traditions mattered because Sunday dinners had become sacred, Coulter looked around at the chaos of conversation and laughter and small grandchildren sticky with dessert and felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was what life was supposed to be. Not perfect, not without its challenges and sorrows, but full, rich, meaningful, populated by people who chose each other, who showed up, who loved through the hard times and celebrated the good times and just kept showing up day after day. Willa caught his eye across the table and smiled, that same steady gaze that had met his across the ranch yard 25 years ago, when she'd been a desperate widow with nothing, and he'd been a broken widower who'd forgotten how to hope. That look said, "We made it. Against all odds, against every challenge, we made it." And they had. Years later, when Coulter Vane finally passed in his sleep, at the age of 86, with Willa holding his hand and his children surrounding his bed, his last words were simple. "Best decision I ever made was letting you stay." "Best decision I ever made was asking to," Willa whispered back. And it was true for both of them. The best decision, the bravest choice, the leap of faith that had transformed two broken people into one whole family. They'd built something lasting from dust and hope and stubborn determination, something that outlived them both in the ranch that still bore the Vane name, in the children and grandchildren who carried forward their legacy of choosing love over fear, of standing up for what mattered, of never giving up even when the world seemed determined to break them. The notice in the dust had brought them together. Hiring, ranch cook, meals for one, room provided. Simple words that had changed everything. And from that simple beginning, they'd built a home, a family, a life worth living. Sometimes that's all it takes. A chance offered, a risk taken, a moment of courage when it would be easier to run. Sometimes that's everything.